My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 36 years old. This happened in the fall of 2023 when my husband, Jake, and I decided to escape our hectic city lives and reconnect amidst the wild, haunting beauty of Lynnville Gorge, North Carolina. I had always been fascinated by local folklore and the mysterious whispers of the Appalachian wilderness, and this trip was meant to be a romantic retreat, as well as a personal exploration of the region's eerie legends. We had driven for hours in our aging RV, a rickety but beloved vehicle that had seen more adventures than I could count. Despite its intermittent electrical glitches and a heater that sputtered in the cold, it was our home on wheels, a sanctuary on the edge of civilization. I had pored over countless articles and books on Lynnville Gorge, its ancient trees, and the supernatural tales whispered by locals for generations. Jake, ever the practical adventurer, preferred to dismiss these stories as fanciful myths. But as we set our sights on a secluded clearing near a rocky overlook, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn into something far more sinister than a mere vacation. The first night arrived with a chill that seemed to seep into our bones. I remember standing outside the RV, watching the tall pines sway in the wind, their rustling leaves echoing like distant murmurs. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly, and I wrapped my arms around myself as I listened to the forest's nocturnal symphony. It was then that I heard it, a faint, almost childlike giggle carried on the breeze. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on my mind, but as the sound grew more distinct, dread began to claw at my heart. "Jake, did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly as I stepped back inside. Jake, busy checking the RV's dashboard lights that flickered erratically, barely glanced up. "Hear what, Em? It's just the wind. You know how these woods can play tricks on you," he said, a dismissive edge in his tone. His practical nature often clashed with my tendency to worry, and this was one of many moments where our differing approaches to danger became painfully apparent. Despite his reassurances, I couldn't quell the unsettling feeling that something was off. Later that evening, as we settled in for the night, I decided to explore the area a bit more on my own. With a flashlight in hand and my recorder tucked safely in my bag, ready to capture any eerie whispers of local lore, I stepped outside into the dense darkness. The RV's interior light spilled out onto the gravel, a fragile barrier against the overwhelming black of the forest. I followed a narrow, winding path that led to a small clearing near a rocky stream. The water trickled softly over smooth stones, and along the banks I noticed something unusual. Faint, scattered footprints that didn't belong to any animal I recognized, and symbols carved delicately into the bark of a nearby oak tree. The carvings resembled ancient indigenous markings, almost as if they were warnings etched into nature's own canvas. I knelt to examine them more closely, my heart pounding as the wind picked up, carrying with it a strange, almost mournful sound, a sound that resembled distant weeping. A sudden movement in the corner of my eye made me spin around. There, just at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure in a tattered white dress. Her appearance was ephemeral, like a wisp of fog given shape. The woman's eyes were hollow and sorrowful, and for a moment I felt as though she was silently pleading with me, warning me of the dangers lurking in the darkness. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat as she vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. Shaken, I hurried back to the RV, where Jake was waiting, his face a mixture of concern and exasperation. "Em, what took you so long?" "I was starting to worry," he said. His eyes, however, betrayed his own unease as he noticed my pallor. I saw something," I stammered, trying to catch my breath. "There was a woman in a white dress, and there were these strange symbols on the trees. It wasn't just the wind, I felt watched." Jake frowned, running a hand through his hair, Look, I know you've been reading too many of those old ghost stories, but we're here to have a good time, right? Maybe you're just overreacting." That night, as we tried to sleep in the cramped confines of the RV, the tension between us was palpable. Our earlier disagreement about the supernatural stories we'd encountered simmered into a silent battle of wills. While I was consumed by the eerie events and the growing sense of dread, Jake's skepticism provided a grim counterpoint. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the edge of something dangerous. The following day, we decided to make the most of our daylight hours and explore the local area. I had planned to visit a small local museum that preserved the history and legends of Lynnville Gorge, hoping to find more clues about the spirit I had encountered. Jake reluctantly agreed, and we packed our gear into the RV, setting off down a dusty, winding road. At the museum, an elderly curator named Mr. Henderson greeted us with a knowing smile. His lined face and careful eyes spoke of decades spent preserving the lore of these ancient lands. "You're not the first to seek the truth behind these woods," he said softly. "There are stories passed down about a woman who met a tragic end, betrayed by those she loved, and now she wanders these parts, her spirit restless and vengeful." I listened intently as Mr. Henderson recounted the legend, noting details that mirrored the eerie encounter from the previous night. According to local tradition, the spirit was not merely a ghost wandering aimlessly, she was a harbinger of darker forces, a presence that sometimes merged with the malevolent energies of the Wendigo legends, embodying a terrifying duality of sorrow and rage. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the RV with a renewed sense of urgency. I was determined to document every detail, every whisper of the supernatural, even as Jake's skepticism deepened. That evening, while Jake fiddled with the RV's unreliable heater, I set up my recording equipment and made notes on everything I had observed. The chill in the air was growing more intense, and as dusk fell, I couldn't help but feel that the forest was closing in around us. It wasn't long before the signs of an impending storm became evident. Dark, heavy clouds gathered above, and the wind howled with a fury that sounded almost like anguished cries. That night, a violent gust of wind rattled the RV, and the power flickered ominously. I lay awake, listening to the disquieting symphony of creaks and groans from the old vehicle, mixed with the relentless whispers of the woods outside. Then came the moment that changed everything. In the dead of night, after a particularly heated argument where Jake had dismissed my concerns as mere paranoia, the RV shuddered violently. I was jolted awake by a deafening crash and the sound of splintering wood. The interior lights dimmed, and a sense of foreboding filled the cramped space. I could hear Jake's heavy breathing from the adjacent room as he scrambled to assess the damage. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice laced with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I joined him at the doorway, and together we peered out into the inky darkness. The storm had intensified, and rain lashed against the RV's windows. But amidst the clamor of the storm, there was something else, a low guttural chanting emanating from the woods. It wasn't the wind, it was deliberate, almost as if someone or something were performing a ritual. My heart pounded as I remembered Mr. Henderson's words about traditional rites and the local legends of vengeful spirits. "Jake, we need to get out of here," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm's fury. Before he could respond, the chanting grew louder, punctuated by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably human. We scrambled to lock the RV doors, our earlier arguments forgotten in the face of immediate danger. For a few excruciating minutes, we huddled together, straining to make sense of the surreal terror unfolding outside. Through the rain and swirling mist, I caught sight of a figure moving with unnatural haste, a dark, shadowy shape that darted between the trees. At one point, the shape seemed to pause, its eyes glinting in the intermittent flashes of lightning. I recognized those hollow, sorrowful eyes from the encounter by the stream. It was her again, the ghostly woman in the white dress. But now, there was something else about her. In a brief, horrifying moment, her form contorted into something monstrous, with hints of animalistic features reminiscent of the Wendigo legends. The transformation was as brief as it was terrifying, leaving me with the stark realization that the spirit was far from passive. As the storm raged on, the supernatural presence intensified. The RV's fragile barriers were repeatedly tested as unseen forces hurled objects against its walls. In one particularly violent moment, a large branch crashed through the side of the RV, narrowly missing Jake. The physical danger was now undeniable, and our disagreement over the existence of these forces melted away into a shared resolve to survive. Desperation drove me to recall more of the legends I'd researched. Local lore mentioned that the restless spirit could be appeased, or at least contained, through ancient rituals, a blend of Native American rites and Appalachian traditions. With no time to waste, I rifled through our scant supplies and found an old journal that Mr. Henderson had given me, containing cryptic notes about a ritual meant to pacify the malevolent force. "Jake, listen to me," I said, my voice firm despite the fear. "I think we can do something. The journal talks about a ritual performed at a sacred rock formation not far from here. We need to go there now." Jake, his face etched with pain from his recent injury and shock from the chaos, nodded slowly. "All right, Em. I trust you. Let's do it." With the storm still raging, we bundled up in what little protective clothing we had and set out on foot, leaving the battered RV behind. The wind whipped around us as we navigated the rocky, treacherous trails. Every step felt like a battle against the elements and the unseen terror lurking in the shadows. The path was barely visible, illuminated only by intermittent flashes of lightning and the weak beam of my flashlight. As we drew nearer to the sacred rock formation described in the journal, the chanting from the woods seemed to recede, replaced by an eerie silence that was even more unsettling than the storm. The rock formation itself was imposing. An ancient outcrop of jagged stones arranged in what could only be interpreted as a ritualistic pattern. The air here was heavy with the weight of centuries of history and forgotten sorrows. Following the instructions from the journal, I began the ritual. I recited the incantations in a trembling voice, while Jake, though skeptical, helped by holding a small bundle of dried herbs and a container of water. Every word I uttered felt like an invocation, a desperate plea for peace. The wind seemed to respond, swirling around us in a vortex of sound and fury. For several agonizing minutes we stood there, our voices lost in the tumult of nature, our hearts pounding in unison with the rhythm of the earth. And then, as if the universe had finally taken pity on our plight, the air shifted. The oppressive energy that had plagued us seemed to lift, replaced by an almost palpable calm. In that moment, I felt the spirit's presence recede, its malevolence giving way to a sorrowful resignation. I dared to hope that we had succeeded, that the ritual had pacified the force that had threatened our very existence. But deep within me, I knew that this was not the end. The supernatural had left its mark on Lynnville Gorge, and its influence would linger in ways we could not yet comprehend. Returning to the RV in the aftermath of the storm was like stepping into a surreal, half-remembered nightmare. The vehicle bore the scars of the night's violence, and every creak and groan seemed to whisper of the horrors we had just endured. Jake and I sat in silence for a long time, the events of the night settling into our bones. The argument that had once divided us now seemed trivial compared to the profound truth we had encountered. The wilderness held secrets far older and more dangerous than our modern minds could fathom. In the days that followed, we repaired what we could of the RV and attempted to resume a semblance of normalcy. But neither of us was the same. The spirit, the woman in white, continued to appear in our peripheral vision, always at the edge of the light. A ghostly reminder of the night when our lives changed forever. Sometimes, I would catch a glimpse of her sorrowful eyes in a window reflection, or see her silhouette drifting past in the darkness. There were moments when the forest seemed to breathe, its rhythm a constant reminder that we were not alone. Our experience in Lynnville Gorge became both a cautionary tale and a personal testament to the power of ancient lore. I recorded every detail for my podcast, determined to share our story with those who dared to listen. I spoke of the eerie laughter in the night, the carved symbols on the trees, and the violent, transformative presence of the spirit. I recounted the storm, the RV's failing equipment, and the desperate ritual that had temporarily quelled the malevolent force. And through it all, I emphasized the fragile balance between skepticism and belief, a balance that, once disrupted, could open the door to horrors beyond imagining. Jake, once a staunch skeptic, now carries the memory of that night like a scar. His practical nature has been tempered by the realization that some forces in the world defy explanation. We both learned that survival in the wild isn't just about battling the elements or fixing broken equipment. It's about confronting the unknown and finding a way to coexist with mysteries that are as old as time itself. Even now, as I write these words and listen to the faint echoes of the past, I wonder if the spirit will ever be fully at rest. Lynnville Gorge remains as beautiful and foreboding as ever, a place where nature and legend intertwine, and where the veil between the living and the dead is perilously thin. My journey into that haunted wilderness taught me that the supernatural is not always a distant myth, but a living, breathing presence that can reach out and change your life in the blink of an eye. I still keep that old journal on my shelf, a memento of our harrowing ordeal, and a reminder of the night when fear and faith collided. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind whispers through the pines, I swear I hear that distant, mournful laughter, a reminder that in Lynnville Gorge the past is never truly gone, and the spirits of ancient sorrow still roam free. In the end, our RV trip became a journey of survival, not just against the elements or the failing machinery, but against the darkness that dwells within both nature and the human soul. It was a confrontation with the forces that have haunted these lands for centuries, forces that can be both vengeful and tragically misunderstood. And while the immediate threat was quelled that stormy night, the memory of those eerie encounters continues to haunt me, a spectral presence that lingers at the edge of my consciousness, forever intertwined with the wild, untamed heart of Lynnville Gorge. My name is Mark Thompson, and I'm 42 years old. This happened in the fall of 2023, when I decided to leave behind the chaos of my urban life for a solitary RV camping trip deep in Uwharrie National Forest, North Carolina. I was desperate to escape my past, haunted by regrets and memories that refused to fade, and I hoped that the isolation of the wilderness might force some kind of inner reckoning. Little did I know that my journey would lead me to a cursed stretch of road known locally as the Devil's Road. I set out early on a chilly October morning, my old RV packed with the bare necessities and a few relics of my former life, a tattered journal, some tools, and a few mementos to remind me of who I once was. The vehicle, a relic in its own right, with its outdated navigation system and a history of mechanical gremlins, had been my steadfast companion on many such trips. But on this journey, as I drove further into the heart of Uwharrie, even the RV seemed to groan under the weight of the unknown. After several hours of meandering down narrow, tree-lined roads, I found myself on a particularly isolated stretch that locals referred to as the Devil's Road. The name sent an involuntary shiver down my spine, though I tried to dismiss it as mere superstition. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that clung to the air, like an invisible fog that muffled the world around me. My GPS began to act up shortly after I entered this area, stubbornly refusing to update, leaving me relying on faded paper maps and instinct to guide me. That first night, I parked my RV in a small clearing adjacent to a weathered service station that appeared almost out of place amid the dense forest. The sky was overcast, and an inexplicable chill cut through the air as darkness fell. I set up camp with a practiced routine, checking the engine, testing the heating system, which sputtered intermittently, and finally settling down with a cup of lukewarm coffee. But as the wind picked up and rustled the skeletal branches of ancient oak trees, I noticed a strange, almost deliberately placed graffiti on one of the trees. Modern, satanic symbols were crudely etched into the bark, their jagged lines illuminated briefly by the flash of lightning in the distance. My heart pounded faster as I took in the sight, feeling a sense of dread I couldn't quite name. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than vandalism, an act of defiant mischief by some local troublemaker. Yet, as I prepared to retire for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the graffiti was a warning, a sign that I had trespassed into a territory far older and more sinister than I had imagined. Before I could settle back into the RV, I decided to check on my surroundings. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. The clearing was eerily quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the wind. It was then that I noticed an old pickup truck slowly pulling into the service station. The truck was battered and dust-covered, its headlights dim but steady. A figure emerged from the cab, an elderly man with deep-set eyes and a voice that seemed as rough as the gravel beneath my feet. "Evening," he said in a gravelly tone, his eyes scanning me as if he could see the shadows lurking behind my cautious gaze. "You new around these parts?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, just passing through. I'm Mark." He grunted in acknowledgement before leaning closer. "Mark, be careful on that Devil's Road. There's more to these woods than just trees and critters. They say the devil himself rides here, and the road twists in ways that can twist your mind. Don't say I didn't warn you." His words echoed in my mind as I returned to my RV. The rest of the night passed in a restless haze. I lay awake listening to the creaks and groans of the aging vehicle, and more disturbingly, the soft, almost imperceptible whisper of voices carried on the wind. Voices that seemed to murmur my name, though I was sure I was alone. The following morning, determined to push past the lingering unease, I set out to explore deeper into the forest. I decided to follow the road despite its ominous name. The further I drove, the more the landscape seemed to distort. The familiar landmarks from my map blurred into twisted silhouettes of gnarled trees and rugged, uneven terrain. Every so often, the RV's dashboard would flicker, as if warning me to turn back, but my inner need for escape and understanding urged me onward. As I ventured deeper, I began to notice unsettling signs along the roadside. On several occasions, I spotted mysterious symbols etched into the rocks and trees, symbols that looked like a strange mix of ancient runes and modern scribbles. They were often accompanied by inexplicable scratches on my vehicle's side, as if some unseen force had deliberately marred the metal. The isolation of the road amplified every sound. The crunch of gravel beneath my tires, the rustling of dry leaves, and, at times, an eerie silence that felt almost tangible. Late one afternoon, as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, I stopped at a small clearing to inspect my RV and perform some much-needed maintenance. I was kneeling beside a stubborn bolt when I heard it. a low, guttural chanting coming from somewhere in the woods. The sound was unmistakably human, yet it carried a weight of malice that made my blood run cold. I froze, my hand gripping the wrench tightly as the chanting grew louder and more rhythmic, interspersed with the occasional sharp cry that cut through the heavy air. Shaken, I hurried back into the RV, locking the door behind me as I tried to rationalize the sounds. I convinced myself it was probably a group of locals engaged in some bizarre ritual or protest. But deep down, I knew there was something far more sinister at work. That night, as a violent storm began to brew overhead, I sat in the dim light of the RV trying to piece together the events of the day. The intermittent hum of the heater and the pitter-patter of rain on the roof did little to soothe my escalating anxiety. I pulled out my journal, a battered notebook filled with scribbled thoughts and memories, and began to write, attempting to capture the eerie details that had so disturbed me. My pen trembled as I documented the satanic graffiti, the strange symbols, and the haunting chant from the woods. In the dead of night, the storm reached its peak. Thunder rolled across the sky, and heavy rain pounded the RV. I was just drifting between wakefulness and sleep when a deafening crash jolted me upright. The RV shuddered violently, and for a moment I was convinced that the very foundations of the vehicle were giving way. I scrambled to the door and peered out into the stormy darkness. There, amidst the torrential rain, I saw something that defied all reason. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Its form was indistinct, cloaked in darkness, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me. The figure did not move, yet its presence exuded an intensity that made my skin crawl. My pulse thundered in my ears as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, even as I knew deep down that there was no one around who could come to my aid. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the back of the RV, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The storm eventually subsided, leaving behind a haunting silence that seemed to magnify every creak and rustle. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and haunted by dreams of twisting roads and demonic laughter. The next morning, I decided that I couldn't let fear dictate the rest of my journey. I needed answers, and I was determined to uncover the truth behind the Devil's Road. I set off again, leaving the safety of the clearing behind. With the storm past and the sky a pale blue, the forest appeared almost normal, its beauty a stark contrast to the terror of the night before. I drove slowly, every so often glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that mysterious figure following me. My mind raced with possibilities. Had the old man been right? Was I truly in the presence of something otherworldly? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my inner demons, those dark memories and guilt that had driven me to seek solitude, were now colliding with an external force that defied explanation. As the day wore on, I found myself approaching a fork in the road where the asphalt seemed to twist unnaturally. I recalled the strange symbols and scratches that had begun to appear on my RV, each mark a silent testimony to the relentless presence that lurked in these parts. The tension in the air was palpable, and my senses screamed that I was venturing into territory that was not meant for the living. Without warning, the RV's dashboard lights flickered and the engine sputtered. I pulled over to the side of the road, frustration mounting as I tried to diagnose the problem. The RV, my only refuge in this alien landscape, was failing me at the most critical moment. As I fumbled with the tools and tried to figure out what had gone wrong, I heard footsteps approaching. I froze, my heart pounding in the sudden silence that followed the mechanical failure. Out of the gloom, a figure emerged. A younger man, probably in his late 20s, with a rugged look and wary eyes. He introduced himself as Caleb, a local who claimed to know these woods like the back of his hand. Caleb told me that he had been tracking disturbances on the Devil's Road for years. His voice was low and earnest as he recounted eerie tales of encounters with the devilish presence, of vehicles broken down inexplicably, and of the twisted reflections seen in dark, murky pools along the roadside. I listened, torn between skepticism and the mounting evidence that every strange event I'd witnessed was not merely coincidence. Caleb explained that the devilish entity was said to be a manifestation of the forest's dark energy, a force that preyed upon those burdened by inner demons and guilt, twisting them into something grotesque. He warned me that if I continued further down that road, I would need to confront not only the supernatural force, but also the hidden aspects of my own soul. Caleb offered to help me with the RV, and despite my reservations about involving another person in this nightmare, I accepted. Together, we managed to patch up the temporary electrical failure, though it was clear that the RV's problems were more than just mechanical. They were the physical manifestations of an unseen, malevolent force at work. That evening, as dusk fell and the forest turned an ominous shade of indigo, Caleb and I set up camp near an ancient stone outcropping he said was revered by locals. He described it as a kind of spiritual fulcrum, a place where the veil between the living and the damned was perilously thin. With a mix of reluctance and determination, I agreed that we should perform a makeshift ritual, a desperate attempt to appease whatever dark presence haunted this cursed stretch of road. Under Caleb's guidance, I gathered some dried herbs, a small container of water, and a few relics I had found in the RV's clutter, items that, in my clouded mind, suddenly seemed imbued with meaning. In the fading light, we circled the stone formation and recited incantations that Caleb had learned from the old-timers. My voice shook as I joined in, each word an appeal for deliverance from the darkness that had ensnared me. The wind picked up, and for a fleeting moment I felt as though the very air vibrated with the force of unseen spirits. For several long minutes we stood there in silence, the only sounds the murmuring wind and our own heavy breathing. I wasn't sure if the ritual had made any difference, but I sensed a slight easing in the oppressive atmosphere, a pause in the malevolent energy that had clung so tightly to me over the past days. That night, in the fragile safety of our shared camp, I lay awake, my thoughts swirling with uncertainty. The shadows outside seemed to stretch and twist, and I kept expecting the ghostly figure or some other hideous form to emerge from the darkness. In the depths of my mind, the old man's warning and Caleb's dire accounts echoed relentlessly. I had come seeking solace and escape from my past, only to find myself face to face with the very embodiment of evil that had haunted these woods for generations. In the early hours of the morning, as a cold mist settled over the forest, I was jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl emanating from just beyond the flickering light of our campfire. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest, and reached for my flashlight. Caleb was already on his feet, eyes scanning the darkness with an intensity born of long familiarity with these woods. Without a word, he gestured for me to follow him as he moved cautiously toward the sound. We crept through the undergrowth until we reached a small clearing where the moon's pale light revealed something I wished I could unsee. There, in the center of the clearing, lay a series of deep scratches in the earth, scratches that looked disturbingly like claw marks. The sight of them, fresh and raw, confirmed that whatever had been stalking us was not content with merely haunting our thoughts. It was actively trying to make its presence known. Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. It's getting bolder. They say the devil rides these woods at night, preying on those who bear heavy burdens. I believe it's coming for you, Mark. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. The notion that my inner guilt and regret could have summoned something so dark and dangerous was almost too much to bear. Yet, deep down, I knew that my past was something I could no longer run from, even if it manifested as a malevolent force on the devil's road. With the rising sun, our brief foray into the clearing ended, and we returned to the relative safety of the RV. Over the next several days, Caleb and I attempted to make sense of the relentless attacks. The RV continued to malfunction sporadically, each breakdown accompanied by strange occurrences, a reflection in the window that wasn't my own, inexplicable rearrangements of our supplies, and moments when the line between reality and nightmare blurred alarmingly. Every night, I would lie awake, haunted by the persistent memory of those claw marks and the old man's cryptic warning. I began to document everything in my journal, scribbling down every odd detail, every unsettling sign, desperate to capture the truth of what I was experiencing. The pages filled with the descriptions of twisted roads, guttural chants, and a pervasive feeling of dread that seeped into my very soul. Then came the night that would forever change my life. It was a moonless, starless night when the darkness seemed almost tangible. Caleb and I had decided to push further down the treacherous road, determined to reach an area that, according to local lore, held the source of the devilish presence. As we drove, the road seemed to contort and stretch, as if it were a living thing determined to lead us astray. The RV's engine roared in protest, and my knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. Suddenly, without warning, the RV lurched violently as if it had been struck by an unseen force. The vehicle shuddered, and the lights flickered out, plunging us into a suffocating darkness. In that moment, I felt the full force of terror, as if every shadow in the darkness were alive and reaching out to claim me. I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead, its screen as lifeless as the night around us. Caleb's voice, steady despite the chaos, broke the silence. "Mark, stay with me. We need to keep moving." With no other option, we stepped out into the pitch-black night. Our only guide, the sound of our own frantic breathing and the distant, echoing growls that seemed to follow us. I could feel the presence of that malevolent force all around us, closing in with every step. The old man's warning echoed in my mind. This wasn't just a series of unfortunate events, it was a reckoning. In the heart of the darkness, I confronted the truth that I had long avoided. The darkness within me had attracted this evil, and now it was here to claim its due. As we stumbled through the forest, a figure materialized from the shadows, a hulking, demonic silhouette that defied all logic. Its eyes glowed with an infernal light, and in its twisted visage I saw a mirror of my own deepest fears. I felt paralyzed with terror, my mind screaming that I had to run, to escape the nightmare that had become my reality. Caleb grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "You have to fight it, Mark. You can't let it consume you." In that desperate moment, I realized that survival depended on confronting not only the supernatural horror before me, but the darkness that had long festered inside. Summoning every ounce of courage, I steadied myself and, with Caleb's support, faced the demonic apparition head-on. I shouted, my voice cracking with both fear and defiance, reciting a passage from my journal that I had written in a moment of clarity, a plea for forgiveness, an acknowledgement of my past, and an invitation for redemption. The creature recoiled, its glowing eyes dimming as if it were being forced to confront the very source of its power. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent struggle between man and the manifestation of his own guilt. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature dissipated into the night, leaving behind a silence so profound that it seemed to echo in the very air around us. We returned to the RV that night with heavy hearts and wounded bodies, but with the glimmer of hope that perhaps the darkness had been abated, if only for a moment. In the days that followed, I continued to document every detail of the ordeal, my journal becoming both a record of horror and a testament to my own inner journey. Caleb and I parted ways eventually, each of us scarred by the experience but forever bound by the shared nightmare of the Devil's Road. Now, as I sit in a modest apartment far from the foreboding forests of Uvaria, I still feel the weight of that cursed road pressing on my soul. I know that I can never fully escape the past, nor the darkness that lingers in the shadows of my mind. But I also know that confronting that darkness, acknowledging my failures and seeking redemption, was the only way to survive the terror that once stalked me on that endless, twisting road. Every time I close my eyes, I see the twisted asphalt, the eerie symbols etched into the trees, and the demonic figure that mirrored my own inner demons. The memory of those relentless nights, when the devil himself seemed to ride the road, remains etched in my heart. A constant reminder that some journeys are not just about escaping the world, but about facing the darkness within. My time on the Devil's Road taught me that evil is not always an external force. Sometimes it is the culmination of all the guilt and sorrow we bury deep inside. And while I continue to search for meaning in the quiet moments of solitude, I know that the forest will always be there, whispering its dark secrets, waiting for the next soul, brave or desperate, enough to walk its cursed path. My name is Ethan. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of the night that changed everything in Uwharrie National Forest. It all began on a cool October afternoon when my friends and I loaded up our beat-up RV for what we hoped would be an unforgettable escape from city life. My companions were Maya, Trevor, and Jenna, each of us bringing our own strengths and weaknesses to this adventure. We weren't just seeking solace in the wilderness. We were determined to explore the eerie local legends for Jenna's budding podcast series on North Carolina folklore. As we drove along the winding roads toward Uwharrie, I couldn't shake a mix of excitement and unease. The RV, a relic from another time, had seen better days. Its heater sputtered on cold mornings, and its battery was more temperamental than any of us cared to admit. I took pride in leading this expedition, but a quiet dread gnawed at me, an inkling that our journey was about to veer off the planned course. We arrived at a secluded clearing deep within the forest late in the afternoon. The spot was perfect. Tall pines casting long shadows, a dirt road that meandered off into the unknown, and an old, overgrown trail that Jenna pointed out as having historical significance. Setting up camp, we busied ourselves with minor repairs and setting our gear. I spent extra time trying to coax life from the RV's unreliable battery, while Trevor scoffed at our predicament. Maya, visibly anxious, kept glancing at the dense woods surrounding us, and Jenna eagerly started recounting the legend of a wronged Cherokee maiden whose spirit was said to haunt these lands. That evening, as dusk crept in and a thick impenetrable fog rolled through the trees, the RV's heater began to fail catastrophically. The chill seeped into every corner of our makeshift camp, making us all huddle together. I remember the uneasy silence that fell over us as the temperature dropped inexplicably. Then came the first signs that something was not right. A faint, sorrowful humming, almost like a lullaby, drifted from the depths of the forest. I sat by the cracked window listening intently as the sound mingled with what I could have sworn was a child's distant laughter. I tried to dismiss it as the wind, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The tension among us grew palpable. Trevor, ever the skeptic, ridiculed the idea that it could be anything supernatural, blaming the sounds on our own nervous imaginations. Maya's eyes were wide with fear, and Jenna's face was alight with a mix of fascination and dread. I felt the heavy responsibility of keeping everyone calm while grappling with my own inner turmoil. As night fell fully, the fog thickened, and I decided to step outside for a closer listen. With the RV's heater on the fritz and my breath forming small clouds in the cold air, I trudged toward the source of the mysterious humming. Every snap of a twig and rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. A pale, fleeting figure in traditional Cherokee attire disappearing behind a cluster of trees. My heart pounded as I hurried back to the RV, eager to share my discovery with the group. I recounted what I had seen, but my words only deepened the divide among us. Trevor's laughter rang hollow as he dismissed it as a trick of the light, while Maya trembled, insisting that she too had felt a presence. Jenna grew animated, pulling out an old leather-bound notebook filled with sketches and notes about local lore. According to her research, our encounter might be connected to the legend of a wronged maiden whose spirit had been bound to these woods after a grave injustice was committed against her people. She spoke of desecrated burial grounds and curses that had followed in the wake of modern encroachment on sacred land. The next morning, we awoke to a heavy mist clinging to the forest floor and an RV that refused to start properly. Our equipment was failing us at every turn. Trevor muttered about the absurdity of it all, yet even he couldn't ignore the eerie, inexplicable chill that seemed to settle into his bones. We decided to press on, leaving the RV behind for a while as we investigated the trail Jenna had mentioned. A narrow, overgrown path marked by symbols etched into the bark of ancient trees. These markings, she explained, were identical to those found in old Cherokee legends about a vengeful spirit. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew even colder and the oppressive silence more suffocating. Maya led the way, her eyes darting around nervously, while Trevor documented our progress on his phone, a futile attempt to rationalize the unexplainable. I took the lead, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, yet compelled by a force I couldn't name. It wasn't long before we encountered another sign of the supernatural. In a small clearing, we discovered a circle of stones arranged in a pattern that resembled an ancient ritual site. The ground was littered with dried leaves and twigs that had been meticulously swept away, as if by an unseen hand. In the center, an inexplicable chill radiated outwards, seeping into our very souls. The sound of that ghostly humming was now accompanied by whispers. Soft, almost pleading voices that seemed to echo the sorrow of a life lost long ago. By late afternoon, the tension among us reached a breaking point. Our group was divided between those who believed in the legends and those who dismissed them as figments of overactive imaginations. Trevor's skepticism turned into bitter sarcasm, and Maya's anxiety spiraled into near panic. Jenna, however, remained strangely calm and collected, her focus fixed on deciphering the cryptic symbols and piecing together the historical context of the site. That night, our fears materialized in the form of an encounter that none of us would ever forget. We set up camp near the ritual circle, and as darkness enveloped us, the whispers turned into agonized wails. I awoke to the sound of crashing branches and the panicked shouts of my friends. Rushing outside, I saw a figure emerging from the shadows, a spectral woman in a flowing white dress, her eyes hollow and filled with a profound sadness. Her presence was both mesmerizing and terrifying. She moved with an ethereal grace, her form wavering like mist, yet every step she took left a trail of despair in the air. In that moment, I understood the terrible truth behind Jenna's research. This was the vengeful spirit of the wronged Cherokee maiden, a guardian of a sacred past, now twisted by sorrow and anger. Her gaze met mine, and I felt as if she was pleading for justice, for recognition of the wrongs committed long ago. But her sorrow quickly turned to fury, and she let out a piercing scream that reverberated through the forest. The force of it sent me stumbling backwards, and I could see the others reacting in horror. Trevor, ever the skeptic, tried to snap a few photos, but his hands shook uncontrollably. Maya fell to her knees, sobbing as she reached out towards the apparition, as if trying to offer some kind of comfort. Jenna's face was a mask of grim determination, her voice rising above the chaos as she recited what she had learned from ancient texts, a desperate plea for the spirit to find peace. As the night wore on, the supernatural assault escalated. The spirit alternated between moments of passive, sorrowful haunting and violent outbursts that threatened our very lives. At one point, the RV, which we had abandoned due to its malfunctioning heater and battery, suddenly roared back to life on its own, its lights flickering erratically before plunging us into darkness. It was as if the very technology that was supposed to protect us had become a conduit for the supernatural forces at work. In the midst of the chaos, our fragile alliance began to crumble. Trevor's sarcastic remarks gave way to raw panic when a branch crashed down near him, narrowly missing his head. Maya's terror transformed into a desperate, almost trance-like state where she seemed to be communicating with the spirit in a language none of us understood. And I found myself torn between my instinct to lead us to safety and the inexplicable compulsion to understand the haunting that had invaded our lives. I gathered what resolve I could and rallied the group, urging them to follow me along a narrow forest path that I hoped would lead us back to a more secure area. The spirit's presence seemed to follow us, her mournful wails and sudden, violent gusts of wind making it clear that she was not about to let us go easily. Every step we took was a battle against the oppressive darkness and the malevolent force that haunted the woods. It was then that Jenna recalled a fragment of advice from an elderly local she had met before our trip. Something about an old Cherokee ritual that could, if performed correctly, appease a restless spirit. We had little time and even less confidence in our makeshift plan, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Jenna quickly gathered a few natural items: a bundle of sage, some wild herbs, and a small container of water from a nearby stream. With trembling hands, she began to recite an incantation, her voice steady but laden with the weight of centuries of tradition. The air around us shifted as she chanted, and for a brief moment, the violent gusts ceased, replaced by an eerie stillness. The spirit paused, her spectral form hovering at the edge of our circle. It was as if she was listening, caught between the desire to wreak vengeance and the hope of release. But the silence was short-lived. The spirit's expression twisted into something akin to rage, and with a sudden burst of speed, she lunged toward Trevor. In that horrifying instant, the ghost's fury materialized into physical violence. Trevor was knocked off his feet, a forceful blow sending him sprawling onto the cold, hard ground. I rushed to his side, adrenaline surging as I tried to staunch the flow of blood from a deep gash on his head. Maya, overcome with fear and grief, sobbed uncontrollably, while Jenna continued her incantation with a fervor that bordered on desperation. The spirit's presence swirled around us, a maelstrom of grief and malevolence. Every time she surged forward, it felt as if the very air was being torn apart by her wrath. Time seemed to slow as I struggled to maintain order amid the chaos. I managed to pull Trevor into a defensive stance, urging him to crawl behind a fallen log while Jenna and Maya helped shield him. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. How do you fight against a force that is neither entirely human nor entirely malevolent, but rather an echo of past suffering? With the spirit momentarily subdued by Jenna's ritual, I seized the opportunity to lead us back toward the RV. Every step was a battle against despair, every sound in the forest a potential threat. The path was treacherous, and our group's morale was at an all-time low, yet there was a stubborn spark within me that refused to let us succumb to the terror surrounding us. As we neared the RV, a symbol of our once reliable means of escape, we found it in a state of disarray. The engine had died once more, and the flickering lights offered no comfort. But there was little choice. We had to press on. I hoisted Trevor onto my shoulders as best as I could and helped Maya and Jenna follow me through the maze of twisted roots and gnarled trees. The spirit's haunting presence loomed over us, a constant reminder that we were trespassers in a realm where ancient grievances still festered. Just as hope seemed within reach, the spirit reappeared, her full form illuminated by a pale, spectral light. This time, she did not speak or wail. She simply stared at us with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. In that agonizing moment, I felt a profound sorrow, an understanding that her violence was not born solely of malice, but of a desperate need to be acknowledged and to right the wrongs of the past. With a final surge of determination, Jenna stepped forward, her voice soft yet unwavering as she pleaded with the spirit. "We honor you," she whispered, "and we beg for forgiveness for the desecration of your sacred ground. Please, let us leave in peace." The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between our modern world and the ancient sorrow of the forest. For what felt like an eternity, the spirit hovered silently, her form wavering like smoke in the cold night air. Then, as if granting a reluctant mercy, she slowly receded into the shadows. The oppressive energy lifted just enough for us to continue our escape, each of us carrying scars, both physical and emotional, that would forever bind us to this haunted place. We finally managed to crawl back to the RV, its engine now a silent, lifeless witness to our ordeal. As I helped Trevor settle inside and Maya clutched Jenna for comfort, I couldn't help but feel that the spirit's presence would linger long after we left. Our return to civilization was marked by a heavy silence, the forest's haunting refrain echoing in our memories. In the days that followed, as we nursed our wounds and tried to piece together the events of that fateful night, we found ourselves irrevocably changed. Trevor's injury served as a constant reminder of the physical danger we had faced, while Maya's lingering anxiety and Jenna's determined recordings of every whispered detail fed our collective need for understanding. I found myself questioning the line between myth and reality, between modern skepticism and the ancient truths whispered by the wind in Uwari. My nights were plagued by vivid dreams of that spectral maiden, her mournful eyes pleading for justice and redemption. I knew that, despite our desperate attempts to appease her, the pain and sorrow that had birthed her curse were far from resolved. The forest had become a living testament to a broken past, a place where the dead spoke in anguished tones, and the living were forced to reckon with the consequences of long-forgotten transgressions. We eventually left Uwari National Forest, our hearts heavy and our bonds forever tested by the horrors we had witnessed. Jenna's podcast series went on to captivate listeners far and wide, each episode a chilling reminder of that night when we faced a force beyond our control. And though time has passed, I still feel the chill of that cold October night on my skin, the memory of the ghostly figure etched into my mind. Every time I hear the wind howl through the trees or see a shadow flicker at the edge of my vision, I'm transported back to that desolate clearing in the heart of Uwari. I carry the weight of what we experienced, a constant reminder that sometimes the most frightening battles are not fought with weapons or logic, but with the unresolved echoes of history. In the end, survival meant not only escaping physical danger, but also coming to terms with the dark, lingering legacy of those who had been forgotten and wronged by the march of progress. I share my story now not only as a cautionary tale but as a tribute to the spirit of the land, whose sorrow and rage taught me that some wounds never truly heal. And every time I catch a whisper on the wind, I remember that night in Uhari, and the vengeful, grieving eyes of a ghost who still walks the ancient trails, seeking justice in a world that has long since forgotten its sacred promises. My name is Darren, I'm 41 years old, and this is the story of the night my inner demons came alive deep in Pisgah National Forest. I had spent too many sleepless nights haunted by memories I couldn't outrun, and after a particularly crushing loss, I decided to escape the city and seek refuge on the open road. Renting an old RV, a clunky, temperamental beast that reminded me all too much of my own battered state, I headed into the wilderness, hoping that solitude might bring healing. I parked my RV at a forgotten campground near a stand of ancient trees, their gnarled branches twisting against a sky that threatened rain. The isolation was exactly what I'd craved. A place where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves, the creak of old wood, and the distant murmur of nature. Yet, even as I settled in, I couldn't shake a nagging sense that this journey was about to force me to confront parts of myself I'd long buried. The first day was a quiet one. I spent my time tinkering with the RV, tightening bolts, replacing a few fuses, and wrestling with a flickering light that danced on the edge of darkness. Every malfunction reminded me of my own perceived failures, the moments when life had sputtered and stalled. Still, I pressed on, determined to find solace among the whispering pines and moss-draped rocks. Late that afternoon, while cleaning the interior of the RV, I caught something off in the mirror, a reflection that didn't quite match my movements. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or fatigue playing havoc with my mind, but as the minutes passed, the discrepancy grew more pronounced. My reflection would lag ever so slightly, as if it were an echo of my actions, always a beat behind. The unnerving sensation prickled along my spine, and I couldn't help but wonder if my mind was on the verge of fracturing. That night, as rain began to patter softly against the roof of the RV, I huddled under a threadbare blanket and tried to sleep. Instead of drifting into restful slumber, I lay awake listening to faint murmurs. At first, they were barely audible, like the rustle of dry leaves outside the window. But soon I recognized them as soft, indistinguishable whispers, almost like a murmur of my own thoughts echoing back at me. I tried to dismiss it as the wind or my own overactive imagination, yet deep down I sensed something was very wrong. In the early hours before dawn, the RV's creaks and groans seemed to form a dissonant symphony. Unable to ignore the unease any longer, I set out with a flashlight to explore the cramped confines of the vehicle. While rummaging behind a loose panel near the storage compartment, my hand brushed against a dusty, leather-bound journal. Curious, I pried it free and began to flip through its brittle pages. The entries were written in a careful, looping hand and detailed the experiences of a previous camper, someone who, it seemed, had faced an encounter with a doppelganger, an evil double that haunted his time in these very woods. The journal spoke of a cursed mirror spirit from local Cherokee lore, a shapeshifter that preyed on the heavy hearts of those who wandered too far into solitude. I sat there in the dim light, the journal's cryptic words resonating with the gnawing fear inside me. I couldn't help but draw parallels between my own inner turmoil and the diary's bleak narrative. With each turn of the page, a chilling certainty settled over me. The strange occurrences in the RV were not mere tricks of isolation, but the first signs of a malevolent presence. The following day dawned gray and overcast, the forest shrouded in a damp, almost suffocating mist. I decided to leave the RV for a walk, hoping that the fresh air would clear the fog clouding my mind. I strolled along a narrow trail bordered by towering trees, their trunks etched with the scars of time. As I walked, I noticed that the trail's surface was uneven and littered with twigs and fallen leaves that seemed to have been carefully brushed aside in certain areas. A sense of being watched crept over me, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to catch a glimpse of someone or something lurking in the shadows. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement, a silhouette that looked eerily familiar. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. There, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, stood a figure that resembled me in every detail, except for the unsettling aura that clung to its form. It was as if I was looking into a warped mirror, one that reflected not who I was, but the darker, hidden parts of me. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only a trail of muddy footprints behind. Footprints that did not match my own. I hurried back to the RV, my mind racing with confusion and dread. Every step felt like a descent deeper into a nightmare from which there was no escape. As I reached the vehicle, I couldn't shake the image of my distorted double. I began to wonder, was I losing my grip on reality, or was something truly supernatural at work? The following evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance and the wind picked up, I decided to confront the mounting terror head-on. I rigged together a small workspace in the RV and pored over the journal again, searching for any clue that might help me understand the inexplicable events. The entries grew darker with each page, describing an encounter with a cursed reflection, a doppelganger that was not content to simply mimic its victim, but instead sought to embody all their guilt, sorrow, and regret. The previous camper had written of a night when his double emerged fully formed, its eyes blazing with a malevolent fire, and how the creature's presence was accompanied by an almost tangible sense of despair. As the storm outside intensified, I felt the oppressive energy in the room begin to shift. The temperature dropped sharply, and the gentle pitter-patter of rain gave way to a deafening clamor. I could see my breath in the air, and the shadows cast by my flickering lamp seemed to twist and dance in impossible patterns. Then, in a moment that will forever be seared into my memory, I saw my doppelganger for real. It happened in the dim reflection of a cracked mirror hanging on the RV's wall. For a brief, agonizing second, I saw the figure's eyes, a mirror of my own, yet filled with an unfathomable sorrow and malice. It smiled a twisted, unnatural smile that sent shivers down my spine. The reflection began to move independently, its movements deliberate and fluid, as if it were alive and aware of me watching. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest, unable to tear my eyes away from the horror before me. The doppelganger stepped out of the mirror as if crossing an invisible threshold, its form solidifying in the dim light of the RV. I could see every detail, the way its face contorted with the weight of unspoken anguish, the way its eyes seemed to beckon me into a confrontation I wasn't sure I could win. It began to speak, its voice a low, guttural echo of my own inner thoughts, dredging up memories of loss and regret that I had fought so hard to bury. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. The entity taunted me with whispers of my failures, my regrets, and the guilt that had haunted me for years. Each word was like a blow, striking at the very core of my being. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I found myself paralyzed by the overwhelming realization that this creature was not an external monster to be defeated with physical force. It was a manifestation of the darkness within me. In that moment of despair, the storm outside reached its crescendo. Rain lashed at the windows, and thunder roared like the wrath of the gods. The RV shuddered as if caught in the grip of an otherworldly force, and I knew that I had to act quickly before the situation spiraled completely out of control. I took a shaky breath and forced myself to speak, my voice trembling as I addressed the doppelganger. "I know what you are," I whispered, my eyes locked on the figure. "You're everything I've tried to hide, every mistake I've made, every regret I can't let go of." My words hung in the air, heavy with both defiance and sorrow. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, as if in response to my confession, the doppelganger's expression shifted. Its eyes, which had been filled with such malignant energy, softened just slightly, enough for me to glimpse the pain buried beneath the surface. In that fleeting second, I realized that this entity was not my enemy in the conventional sense. It was a reflection of my inner turmoil, a cursed mirror of my soul that had been forced into the physical world by my own unacknowledged despair. But understanding did not lessen the danger. The doppelganger's presence caused objects in the RV to rattle and shift, and the very air seemed to crackle with a dangerous energy. It advanced toward me, its movements deliberate and inexorable. I stumbled back, my back hitting the cold metal of a cupboard, and my mind raced with a single thought. I had to confront this manifestation of my darkest self, or risk being consumed by it. Desperation lent me courage, and I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm tired of running. It's time I faced what I've been avoiding all these years." The words echoed in the confined space of the RV, challenging the relentless force that had haunted me. For a moment, the doppelganger paused, its head cocked as if considering my declaration. The silence was profound, filled with the weight of years of unspoken grief and regret. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, the figure lunged at me. We clashed in a violent, surreal struggle that blurred the line between physical and psychological reality. The RV's interior erupted in chaos. Furniture toppled, glass shattered, and the relentless storm outside provided a grim soundtrack to the battle unfolding within these four walls. I fought not just with my fists, but with every ounce of willpower I had left. Every blow I delivered was symbolic, a rejection of the guilt and sorrow that had defined me for so long. In the midst of the struggle, I managed to pin the doppelganger against the wall. Our eyes met, and in that intense, wordless exchange, I saw my own suffering mirrored back at me in raw, unfiltered clarity. "I forgive myself," I declared, voice trembling yet resolute. "For all the mistakes I made, I accept the pain, and I let it go." The words, spoken with a mixture of relief and anguish, seemed to hang in the charged air. For a heartbeat, the world fell silent. The doppelganger's form wavered, as if caught in a ripple of light and shadow, and then, almost imperceptibly, it began to fade. The struggle subsided as abruptly as it had erupted. I collapsed onto the floor, heart pounding and body trembling, while the storm outside gradually eased into a soft patter. I wasn't sure if the entity had truly been vanquished or if it would return in another guise, but in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of release. The oppressive weight of guilt had been lessened, if only slightly, by facing the specter of my own inner darkness. In the aftermath of that harrowing confrontation, I spent a long sleepless night in the RV. I scribbled down everything I could remember in a fresh journal, a cathartic exercise that felt like a final farewell to the burdens I'd carried for far too long. The reflections in the broken mirror no longer lagged behind my actions, and the once ominous murmurs in the dark had quieted to a gentle, almost comforting whisper. Dawn broke with a muted light filtering through the rain-soaked trees. I stepped outside, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the stormy chaos of the previous night. The forest seemed to have returned to its natural rhythm, as if the supernatural tumult had been nothing more than a passing nightmare. I gathered my scattered belongings and left the RV behind, determined to continue my journey on foot. I needed time to reflect on what had happened and to understand that the real battle was not against some external evil, but against the unresolved emotions that had long haunted my soul. As I walked along the forest trail, each step felt lighter than the last. The old journal I'd found, a testament to another lost soul's struggle, remained in my backpack, a reminder that I was not alone in facing the shadows within. I knew that healing was a process, and that some wounds might never fully close, but for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of hope. The encounter with my doppelganger left me with more questions than answers. Was the cursed reflection a figment of my tormented psyche, or had I truly awakened an ancient spirit tied to local Cherokee lore? Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between, a metaphysical mirror reflecting the timeless human struggle between light and darkness. I eventually found my way back to a small town on the outskirts of the forest. There, I sought solace in the mundane routines of everyday life. A cup of coffee at a corner diner, brief exchanges with kind strangers, and the gentle hum of normalcy that had eluded me for so long. I never spoke of that night to anyone, not out of shame, but because the experience was too personal, too intertwined with the fabric of my own identity. Instead, I carried it with me as a quiet reminder that the most dangerous adversaries are often found within. Months later, as I sat at my desk in a modest apartment far from Pisgah, I still found myself glancing at my reflection with a wary curiosity. The memory of that stormy night, and the ghost of my former self that had emerged from the darkness, remained a vivid part of me. I began to write, pouring my experiences into a manuscript that chronicled the surreal battle between a man and the embodiment of his own despair. It was a story of loss, acceptance, and ultimately redemption. I learned that confronting one's inner demons does not lead to their complete eradication. Rather, it is an ongoing process of understanding and acceptance. Each day, as I walked through life, I carried with me the lessons of that night. That the scars we bear can become the very marks of our strength, and that the journey toward healing is as winding and unpredictable as the trails of Pisgah National Forest. Today, whenever I catch a glimpse of my reflection in a window or see a shadow flicker in the corner of my eye, I no longer recoil in terror. Instead, I see a reminder of the battle I fought in the dark. A silent promise that no matter how heavy the burden of the past, there is always a path toward forgiveness and renewal. My journey through Pisgah wasn't marked by a grand victory over an external monster, but by a quiet, resolute triumph over the darkness inside me. And though the memory of that cursed night lingers like a whisper in the back of my mind, I have come to understand that true survival lies not in escaping our own reflections, but in embracing them, scars and all. That is my story, a testament to the fact that sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront the ghost that dwells within and finally let it go. 03 Mini. My name is Jack Harper. I'm 35 years old, and this happened in the fall of 2022 when I decided to leave behind the relentless chaos of city life and confront the ghosts of my past head-on. I rented an old RV, a battered relic with a temperamental heater, unreliable power, and a communication system that sputtered static more than actual voices, and set out for a solitary retreat near Clingman's Dome in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, North Carolina. I had hoped that a few days away from everything would give me the space to think and heal. After a painful breakup and the recent loss of a close friend, I felt as if I were carrying an invisible weight that clouded my every thought. The isolation of the wilderness promised clarity, even if it meant facing my inner demons in a place where the silence of nature could amplify even the faintest whisper of regret. The drive was long and reflective. I remember watching the leaves turn a fiery mix of reds and golds, their beauty only accentuating the melancholy that simmered beneath my skin. When I finally arrived at the secluded clearing near Klingman's Dome, dusk was already creeping over the mountains. I parked the RV on a narrow dirt road, surrounded by towering trees whose branches intertwined like ancient fingers in prayer. The air was cool and crisp, carrying a faint scent of pine and earth. I set up a small camp outside the RV, not wanting to entirely shut myself away from the world, even if it was just nature. That first night, as I settled in and tried to ignore the creaks and groans of the old RV settling into the ground, I noticed something odd. In the small puddle of rainwater by the RV's door, my reflection seemed to linger a moment too long after I moved away. I chalked it up to exhaustion and the trickery of low light, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I turned in, wrapping myself in a threadbare blanket, determined to get some rest. Sleep, however, proved elusive. I awoke several times to the soft sound of footsteps echoing outside, as if someone, or something, was pacing around the RV. At first, I convinced myself it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal searching for shelter. But when I caught a glimpse of a shadow that moved in perfect mimicry of my own steps, a chill crawled up my spine. I told myself it was stress and loneliness, the overactive imagination of a man grappling with guilt and regret. The next morning, I set out on a short hike to clear my head. With only a lightweight backpack and the RV's rickety battery-powered lights for company, I ventured into the forest. The trail wound through dense trees and mossy clearings, and all around me the forest seemed alive with murmurs and rustles. Yet something was undeniably different about this place. It was as if the forest itself was watching, silently assessing my every step. A few miles in, I reached a small, reflective pool. I paused to catch my breath, and as I looked into the still water, I saw it. A reflection that wasn't quite mine. For an instant, the image showed me standing with a slumped posture, eyes dull and filled with sorrow, as if weighed down by an unseen burden. I blinked hard, and the reflection snapped back to the familiar face of a tired, introspective man. I forced a laugh at my own jitteriness, though my heart pounded with an inexplicable dread. Returning to the RV, I began to notice more inconsistencies. Every time I glanced into a window or a puddle, there was that fleeting moment when my reflection didn't quite match my movements. At one point, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of a dark figure trailing behind me. A figure that moved with my exact gait, but lingered for a heartbeat longer than I would expect. I told myself it was simply a trick of the light or a remnant of my tired mind conjuring up old regrets. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the isolation of the Smokies pressed in around me. I sat on the worn steps of the RV, a cup of weak coffee in hand, and pulled out a battered journal. I began writing down my thoughts, trying to reconcile the images that haunted me throughout the day with the reality of my solitude. The pages filled with lines of self-reproach and half-formed memories, as if I were trying to stitch together the fragments of my identity that had been torn apart by loss. It was then that I first encountered something that shattered any lingering rationality. While scribbling in my journal, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to emanate from within the forest itself. The sound was gentle and melodic, like a lullaby sung by a long-forgotten voice. Yet it was laced with sorrow and an eerie undertone of menace. I rose quickly, my heart racing, and stepped outside to follow the sound. The whisper led me to a clearing near the edge of the tree line. In the dim light, I saw a figure, a perfect, yet distorted, mirror image of myself, standing motionless among the trees. For a long, heart-stopping moment, I stood there, staring at the doppelganger. It was as if I were looking into a warped mirror. My face was identical in every detail, yet the eyes that met mine were hollow and void of the life and hope that I clung to. The figure did not move, did not speak. It simply stood there, an ominous reflection of all the pain and guilt I had tried so hard to bury. I wanted to call out, to ask who it was or what it wanted, but my voice caught in my throat. The silence was overwhelming. Shaken, I retreated back to the RV, locking the door behind me. The rest of the night was a restless blur of half-awake moments and frantic glances into the darkness. Every time I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye, I would jump, convinced that the doppelganger was stalking me from outside. The line between my internal torment and the external reality began to blur, and I could no longer tell if the menacing presence was a product of my tortured mind, or something that existed independently in the oppressive darkness. Over the next few days, the encounters grew more frequent and aggressive. I started to see the doppelganger not just in reflections, but also moving on the periphery of my vision as I went about daily tasks around the campsite. One morning, while I was preparing a simple breakfast inside the RV, I noticed that the image in the cracked mirror across from me seemed to change positions even when I was standing still. I froze, watching in horror as the reflection behind me slowly raised its hand, mirroring my every movement with a slight delay. I spun around, but there was no one there, only the silent, accusing emptiness of the RV. The equipment in the RV began to fail one piece at a time. The unreliable heater sputtered out in the cold nights, leaving me shivering under layers of blankets. The sporadic power cuts meant that I could only rely on a weak battery for light, and the old radio crackled with nothing but static, occasionally interrupted by strange, unintelligible murmurs that sounded eerily like my own voice. I tried to fix these issues, but the tools I had were inadequate, and every attempt only heightened my frustration and fear. Desperate for answers, I ventured into the small visitor center in a nearby town. There, in the dim light of a dusty archive room, I found references to local folklore about shadow fetches, doppelgangers that emerged in times of deep personal crisis, believed to be manifestations of one's inner guilt and remorse. According to an old pamphlet, these entities were not necessarily malevolent at first. They appeared as a warning, a mirror of the soul, but if ignored, they could evolve into dangerous forces that manipulated reality, leading the sufferer into a path of self-destruction. I returned to the campsite with a heavy heart, the pamphlet clutched in my hand. The idea that my own inner demons could be given form was both horrifying and, in a twisted way, comforting. It meant that there was an explanation, however supernatural, for what I was experiencing. Still, the encounters did not subside. In fact, they escalated. One night, as a violent storm raged outside, the doppelganger's presence became impossible to ignore. I was awake, huddled on the floor of the RV, when the door burst open with a gust of wind. Lightning flashed through the narrow windows, illuminating the interior in stark, fleeting bursts. And there, standing at the threshold, was the doppelganger. The figure looked more defined than ever before, its eyes burning with an intensity that pierced through the darkness. In that split second, I felt every ounce of my repressed guilt and sorrow come crashing down. The entity advanced slowly, each step deliberate, as if to reclaim a part of me that I had long denied. I scrambled to back away, my heart pounding in a cacophony that drowned out the roar of the storm. I fumbled for the old radio, desperate to call for help, but it only sputtered more static as if mocking my feeble attempts at escape. The doppelganger's hand reached out, and I swear I felt a cold, intangible grip around my wrist. a touch that was both familiar and utterly alien. It was as if I were being pulled into the depths of my own despair. In that terrifying moment, I realized that confronting this entity meant confronting myself. There was no external force to blame, no external enemy to fight. This was my inner torment made flesh, a reflection of every regret and mistake that I had tried so hard to forget. And yet, the creature was not merely a passive observer. It began to push me, forcing me to stagger backward until I hit the far wall of the RV. My mind reeled with a cocktail of fear and resignation as I struggled to maintain control over my own body. As I lay there, battered and shaking, I mustered every bit of willpower I had left and spoke into the charged air, my voice trembling but resolute. "I see you. I know what you are. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused myself. I accept you, all of you." I repeated the words as if they were a mantra, each syllable a plea for forgiveness, from myself, from the shadow that had haunted me for so long. For several agonizing moments, nothing happened except the relentless pounding of the rain on the RV's roof. Then, as if in response to my confession, the figure paused. The burning intensity in its eyes softened, and the relentless aggression that had defined its presence waned. I felt a strange warmth seep into the cold spaces of my heart, and the oppressive weight of my guilt began to lift, if only slightly. The storm continued outside, but inside the RV the atmosphere had shifted. The doppelganger hovered near the doorway, no longer as a threat, but as a silent witness to my attempt at redemption. I knew that this was not the end. The entity might never fully disappear, and the shadow of my past would always linger. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I sensed a possibility of healing, a chance to reconcile with the person I had been and the person I could still become. In the days that followed, I committed myself to understanding the root of my inner turmoil. I spent long hours in solitude journaling every thought and emotion that surfaced, no longer running from the painful memories that had haunted me for so long. Each time I caught a glimpse of my distorted reflection, I greeted it with a nod of acknowledgement rather than a cry of terror. The presence of my doppelganger became less a source of fear and more a reminder of the journey I had undertaken, a journey toward self-forgiveness. I also began exploring the local legends in greater depth, seeking out the wisdom of those who had faced similar demons. I met with a reclusive historian who lived on the outskirts of a nearby town. Over cups of bitter coffee, he shared stories of others who had encountered shadow fetches, explaining that these entities were believed to be the physical embodiments of one's suppressed remorse. "They come to remind us that we cannot escape our past," he told me gravely. "But they can also guide us if we're willing to listen." His words resonated deeply, and I took them to heart. One misty morning, as I stood outside the RV watching the forest awaken in hues of silver and green, I saw my reflection once more in a puddle near the door. This time, the image was calm and composed. The eyes staring back at me were not those of a tormented soul, but of a man who had come to accept his flaws and face his darkest truths. In that moment, I realized that the doppelganger, as terrifying as it had been, was never truly my enemy. It was a part of me, a fragment of the past that I had to embrace before I could move forward. I know now that survival isn't just about escaping the physical dangers of the wilderness. It's about confronting the parts of ourselves we'd rather keep hidden, acknowledging the pain and mistakes that define our lives, and finding a way to reconcile with them. The great Smoky Mountains, with all their natural beauty and ancient wisdom, taught me that even in the depths of isolation, there can be a path to redemption. Eventually, I fixed some of the RV's more immediate issues enough to restore minimal power, and I managed to contact a friend in town. The connection was shaky and filled with static, yet it was enough to let me know that I wasn't entirely alone in the world. As I prepared to leave the secluded clearing behind, I looked back one last time. In the reflection of a rain-soaked window, I saw not the menacing doppelganger, but my own eyes, clearer, more resolved, and no longer haunted by the ghosts of my past. The journey out of the Smokies was a quiet one, filled with introspection and the steady, determined rhythm of moving forward. I left behind the physical isolation of the mountains, but the lessons I learned there will remain with me always. My encounters with the spectral shadow taught me that the path to healing is often paved with confronting our deepest regrets, and that even the darkest reflections can eventually give way to the light of self-acceptance. My name is Jack Harper, and my time in the Smokies changed me in ways I am still coming to understand. The forest, with its ancient whispers and hidden truths, revealed that sometimes the most dangerous journeys are not the ones we take on winding trails, but the ones we embark on within ourselves. And though I may never fully escape the shadow of my past, I have learned to live with it, no longer as a haunting specter, but as a reminder of the strength it took to finally forgive myself. My name is Lena. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how a simple escape into North Carolina's wilderness turned into a fight for our very survival. A journey marked by supernatural terror that still haunts my waking hours. This happened last October, when my partner Mark and I decided to take our aging RV up to Mount Mitchell for a much-needed break from the chaos of urban life. We left early on a crisp autumn morning, our RV sputtering along the winding roads with its unreliable heater and flickering battery hinting at the troubles ahead. Mark, ever the pragmatic engineer, did his best to reassure me that these were mere technical hiccups. "It's just old age," he would say with a wry smile, though I could sense the worry behind his eyes. I, on the other hand, felt an inexplicable chill, an intuition that something was not right even as the landscape of fiery fall foliage whizzed past our windows. The trip was meant to be a romantic retreat. I had planned to draw inspiration from the rugged beauty of Mount Mitchell, the highest peak east of the Mississippi, and its surrounding forests, steeped in ancient Appalachian lore. I had spent countless nights reading about local legends, particularly the tragic tale of a witch wronged by early settlers whose vengeful spirit was said to curse any who dared disturb her territory. Mark was less enthused by such stories, his skepticism clashing with my fascination. Our early morning banter, although light-hearted at first, quickly escalated into tense debates about the wisdom of venturing off the beaten path to a campsite known as Devil's Hollow, a secluded clearing on the lower slopes of Mount Mitchell. After nearly 2 hours on the road, we finally arrived at our destination. The RV rumbled to a stop near a clearing surrounded by towering pines and rugged outcrops. Immediately, I noticed something odd. Carved into the bark of a large oak was a series of symbols that looked uncannily like ancient Cherokee markings. My heart pounded as I traced my fingers over the grooves. "Mark, look at this," I said softly. He leaned over, squinting in the weak daylight, and shrugged it off as random vandalism. But I knew better. I had read enough local lore to suspect these were warnings. As we set up camp, the tension between us simmered. Mark busied himself with checking the RV's systems, while I unpacked my journal and camera, eager to document our experience. That first night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long and thin across the clearing, I felt an oppressive silence settle over us. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but a weight, a palpable presence that made my skin crawl. At dusk, while Mark prepared a modest dinner on our portable stove, I stepped outside for some fresh air. It was then that I first saw her. A ghostly figure in a flowing white dress, standing motionless in the distance. I froze, heart in my throat. The figure was faint and ethereal, barely visible against the deepening twilight. Yet her eyes seemed to pierce the darkness. I called out softly, "Hello?" but there was no response. When I turned back, the figure had vanished, leaving only a lingering sense of sorrow and warning in the air. I retreated inside, my mind racing with possibilities. Mark tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but I couldn't shake the chill that had settled deep in my bones. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were haunted by disembodied whispers and fleeting images of that spectral woman. I woke with a start, convinced that invisible hands had brushed against me, leaving a bruise on my arm that wasn't there before. The following morning, I discovered an old, weathered journal tucked beneath a rock near our campsite. Its pages, yellowed with age, recounted the tale of a local witch, a woman betrayed by those she once trusted, condemned to roam the mountains in search of vengeance. The entries described eerie rituals and unexplained disappearances, the ink scrawled hurriedly as if the writer had been in the throes of terror. I showed the journal to Mark, but he dismissed it as folklore, an exaggeration born out of old superstitions. Yet, as the day wore on, our equipment continued to malfunction. The RV's heater cut out intermittently, and the electrical system began to act up, plunging us into sporadic darkness even in broad daylight. As night fell on our second day, the supernatural events escalated. While Mark fixed the heater, I noticed a series of scratch marks along the side of the RV. Deep, deliberate gouges that hadn't been there before. Outside, the wind carried faint, indistinguishable whispers, as though voices were trying to speak through the rustling leaves. I felt a primal fear clutch at me, a sense of isolation so complete that even the familiar surroundings of Mount Mitchell became alien and threatening. During dinner, tensions finally erupted. I insisted that we perform a ritual described in the journal, a desperate attempt to appease the restless spirit said to haunt these woods. Mark argued vehemently, his logical mind fighting against what he called romantic nonsense. "There's a rational explanation for all of this," he insisted, though his voice wavered slightly. I pleaded with him, my voice trembling. "Mark, I'm not crazy. I know what I felt out there." His silence, though short, spoke volumes, and I felt our bond strain under the weight of fear and disbelief. That night, the ghost in white made her presence known again, but this time she was closer. I saw her standing just beyond the RV's light, her figure illuminated momentarily as if bathed in moonlight. My pulse raced as I watched her, and in a moment of terror I could swear I saw her extend a hand toward the RV. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with a choking mist that seemed to seep into every crevice of the vehicle. Mark, who had been trying to repair the flickering lights, rushed outside, but by the time he reached the spot, she was gone, leaving behind nothing but the lingering echo of her silent scream. In the days that followed, our ordeal grew even more sinister. The land itself seemed to conspire against us. Paths we had planned to take were inexplicably blocked, and the RV's systems began to malfunction in ways that defied explanation. I started documenting everything, every strange sound, every inexplicable event in my journal. The journal became a lifeline, a record of our descent into a realm where folklore and reality merged into one terrifying nightmare. One afternoon, while Mark was out gathering firewood, I ventured out to explore a nearby trail. The forest was dense, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of unseen creatures. As I walked, I came across more of those ancient carvings, this time on a series of trees lining the path. The symbols were unmistakable warnings, and a shiver ran down my spine. I took out my camera and snapped a few photos, hoping to later analyze the markings. But as I moved deeper into the forest, the shadows seemed to shift and stretch in unnatural ways, and I felt as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move. Returning to camp, I found Mark waiting with a furrowed brow and a look of barely concealed dread. "Lena, I found something," he said, showing me a set of deep scratch marks on a large boulder near our campsite, similar to those on the RV. "I think something's been here, something not of this world." His usual skepticism had been replaced by a raw, unspoken fear. It was then that I realized our ordeal was far from over. That night, as we prepared to sleep in the cramped interior of the RV, the supernatural presence became undeniable. The ghostly figure in white appeared again, this time inside the vehicle. I awoke to a whisper right beside me, a voice that was both mournful and menacing. I sat up, my heart pounding in my ears, and saw a faint outline of the spectral woman hovering near the window. I called out her name, though I knew not what to expect, and she drifted closer, her eyes filled with an unfathomable sadness and anger. In that moment, I understood that she was not merely an apparition, but a force tied to the very land, a spirit born of centuries of injustice and sorrow. Mark and I reached a breaking point. Our earlier disagreements melted away into a shared urgency to escape the tightening grip of the supernatural terror. We made a desperate plan to leave the area at first light. Yet, as midnight approached, the presence intensified. The wind howled with an almost human fury, and the RV shuddered as if struck by unseen hands. The supernatural force was no longer a distant observer. It was here, meddling with our every move, even manipulating the environment to keep us trapped. At the peak of the night's terror, the entity's aggression reached its zenith. I awoke to the sound of frantic knocking on the RV's door. Heart in my throat, I hesitated before opening it, fearing what might be on the other side. Instead of a person, I found the door swinging open on its own, the cold night air rushing in as if inviting me to step outside. In the flickering light, I saw it clearly. The spectral woman, her face contorted in agony, reaching out for me. I screamed, and Mark bolted from his makeshift bed to join me. Together, we scrambled to secure the RV, our hands trembling as we tried to fend off what felt like an invisible assailant. The confrontation was as surreal as it was horrifying. The entity did not speak, but its intentions were clear. It manipulated our environment, knocking over objects, severing wires, and slashing at the RV's exterior with unseen claws. In the chaos, a heavy crash echoed as part of the vehicle's side panel gave way, exposing us to the raw, biting cold of the mountain night. I could see Mark's face, illuminated by the erratic glow of our failing lights, etched with both determination and terror. "We have to get out of here, Lena," he shouted over the cacophony of supernatural fury. Without time for further debate, we abandoned the RV, our hearts pounding as we ran blindly into the dark forest. Every step was a battle against both our fear and the dense, oppressive mist that seemed to close in around us. The forest was no longer a sanctuary of natural beauty. It had become a labyrinth of terror where every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig could be the harbinger of death. As we ran, I clutched my journal, a testament to our harrowing ordeal, hoping it might somehow guide us to safety. The spectral woman seemed to follow at a distance, her presence a constant, ominous reminder that the curse of Mount Mitchell was not one we could easily escape. At one point, I tripped over a hidden root and fell hard, the impact jarring my already battered body. Mark was there in an instant, helping me to my feet, his face set in grim determination despite the palpable fear in his eyes. We stumbled upon a narrow, overgrown trail and decided to follow it, praying it would lead to a nearby road or a sign of civilization. Every step felt like a descent deeper into madness. The forest whispered secrets in a language older than time, and every so often I caught fleeting glimpses of figures moving just beyond the edge of the light. A shadow here, a rustle there, that made my skin crawl. In those moments, I could almost believe that the legends were true, that the land was haunted by forces both supernatural and malevolent. Hours later, as the first light of dawn began to pierce the darkness, we emerged onto a narrow, deserted road. Exhausted and injured, we made our way to a small ranger station that we hoped would offer sanctuary and help. The station, a dilapidated building on the outskirts of the forest, seemed almost abandoned. Its windows dark and its door creaking ominously in the breeze. Yet, inside, a kindly old ranger listened to our story with a solemn nod, his eyes reflecting a deep, unspoken knowledge of the cursed history of these lands. He handed us a map, marked with warnings and notes about recent strange occurrences, and advised us to leave the area immediately. That day, as we slowly made our way back to civilization, the supernatural presence seemed to recede, its violent manifestations abating with the rising sun. But the scars of that night remained. The spectral encounters had left physical marks and deep psychological wounds. Mark's skepticism was forever shattered, replaced by a cautious respect for the inexplicable forces that dwell in the forgotten corners of our world. And I, once a fervent believer in folklore, now carried the heavy burden of having witnessed a haunting that defied all rational explanation. In the weeks that followed, I poured my terror and confusion into my writing. Every detail of our ordeal, every flicker of the ghostly light, every chilling whisper in the dark, found its way into the pages of my journal and later into the manuscript I hoped would become a novel. It was a testament to the inexplicable power of the land, a record of our desperate struggle against a force that seemed born of centuries of sorrow and injustice. Though I have tried to return to a semblance of normalcy, I know that the curse of Mount Mitchell lingers like a shadow at the edge of my vision, a reminder that sometimes the past refuses to remain buried. Even now, on quiet nights when the wind howls and the darkness presses in, I remember that spectral woman in the white dress, and I shudder at the thought of what might have happened if we had not managed to escape. The supernatural force that stalked us was not content to simply haunt from afar. It was a dangerous, violent entity, willing to tear the very fabric of our reality. And while we survived that cursed night, the experience left me forever changed. I learned that in the heart of North Carolina's wild lands, the line between myth and reality is perilously thin, and sometimes, to seek the truth, you must first confront the darkness within and without. That journey, with its tangled threads of terror and love, rationality and myth, remains my most vivid memory, a nightmare etched into my soul. I continue to write, to share our story not as a mere work of fiction, but as a testament to the fragile boundary between our world and the haunting realms that lie just beyond. And though I hope never to return to those cursed woods, I know that the spirit of Mount Mitchell, with all its vengeful sorrow and unyielding menace, will forever be a part of who I am. This is my story, a journey of love, terror, and the relentless pursuit of truth amidst the shadows of an ancient curse. My name is Jonah. I'm 42 years old, and this is the story of how my desperate search for solitude turned into a fight for my very life. This happened last September, when I left behind the clamor of my past and the weight of regret in my old, creaking RV, hoping to find redemption deep in the wilds of western North Carolina. I had spent months preparing for this trip, a chance to escape the memories of a life gone awry. The RV, a battered relic of my truck driving days, was as unreliable as I was uncertain about my future. Its generator coughed and spluttered to life every morning, the heater barely a whisper of warmth, and the electrical system flickered as if protesting every mile we put behind. But I was determined. The open road was my promised sanctuary. Driving along the remote backroads of Nantahala National Forest, I let my thoughts wander. I recalled the tragedies that had pushed me away from society, the loss of friends, a failed marriage, and the mistakes I couldn't forgive myself for. I craved isolation, a space where I could finally come to terms with my past. I was drawn to a secluded area near an abandoned cabin, a place that locals avoided and whispered about in hushed tones, a place they said was cursed by old ways and unspeakable acts. After several hours on the road, the RV and I arrived at a clearing just on the edge of the forest. The location was hauntingly beautiful, a patch of open ground hemmed in by towering pines, with the ruined outline of an old cabin barely visible through the trees. I parked the RV, its engine coughing its last, and stepped out to stretch my legs. The air was cool, carrying an undercurrent of something indefinable, a scent of damp earth and decay that made my skin crawl. While setting up my modest campsite, I couldn't help but notice strange symbols etched deeply into the bark of a nearby tree. They were not random scratches, but deliberate carvings. An eerie fusion of indigenous art and something else, something ritualistic. I paused, running my fingers over the rough markings. They stirred a sense of foreboding inside me, as though the tree itself was a silent sentinel warning me to turn back. I tried to shrug off the chill that crept along my spine, telling myself that isolation often plays tricks on a man's mind. As dusk began to settle, I decided to take a short walk to explore the area. The fading light revealed more signs, additional carvings on the trunks of trees lining the narrow trail, and even small totems fashioned from bones and twigs. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual chirps and rustlings of wildlife conspicuously absent. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of rhythmic chanting carried on the wind. I paused, straining to catch the words, but they were muffled, as if the forest itself guarded its secrets. On my way back, I encountered an old man, a local hermit, seated on a fallen log along the trail. His eyes, clouded by years and hardship, fixed on me as if he'd been waiting. "You best leave this place before nightfall," he rasped. "There's a curse upon these woods, born of old ways and darker deeds." His words, though delivered in a low warning tone, sent a ripple of unease through me. I thanked him and hurried back to my campsite, his cryptic admonition echoing in my mind. I returned to my RV and prepared a small meal over a portable stove, my nerves still on edge. Every creak of the vehicle and snap of a twig outside made my heart race. As night deepened, the RV's lights began to falter. Soon enough, the power died entirely, leaving me in an oppressive, impenetrable darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and sat inside the RV, listening to the subtle sounds of the forest. A mix of distant, deliberate footsteps and low, almost musical chants that seemed to echo closer and closer. A sudden noise jolted me upright, a scraping sound on the side of the RV. I grabbed the flashlight and peered out through a crack in the window. On the metal siding, I saw deep scratch marks, as if an animal, or something else, had clawed its way across. The marks were too deliberate, too human-like. My pulse quickened. I checked outside. Nothing moved, but the chill in the air was unmistakable. Unable to sleep, I scribbled notes in my journal. I recorded every strange detail, the symbols, the hermit's warning, and the unsettling sounds that punctuated the silence. I recalled the hermit's words about a curse, wondering if there was any truth to the legends of a cannibal cult said to lurk in these backwoods. a cult that twisted ancient indigenous rituals into savage rites of blood and bone. I shivered at the thought, yet a part of me was compelled to dig deeper into the mystery. Sometime later, I ventured out into the darkness, determined to explore despite the mounting dread. I moved slowly, my flashlight barely cutting through the thick gloom. The forest was a maze of shadows and whispering leaves. I soon came across the old cabin, its silhouette a decaying outline against the starless sky. The door creaked on its hinges as I pushed it open, and inside, the smell of damp rot and stale air was overwhelming. In a hidden drawer of an old wooden desk, I discovered a crudely drawn map and a few personal belongings: a torn piece of cloth, a rusted knife, and what appeared to be a scrap of paper bearing a strange symbol that matched those on the trees. The map showed a series of paths converging near the cabin, marked with ominous notes and warnings. My heart pounded as I realized that these signs weren't mere superstition. They pointed to something very real, a presence or even a gathering that had taken place here recently. As I turned to leave, I heard hushed voices outside. I pressed myself against the cold wall of the cabin, barely daring to breathe. Through a gap in the boarded-up window, I saw several figures moving slowly beneath the canopy of trees. They were dressed in dark, ragged clothing, their faces hidden behind crude masks fashioned from animal hides and bone. The figures circled the cabin in a slow, deliberate procession. My mind raced as I pieced together the implications. These were not mere drifters, but members of a cult, likely the cannibalistic sect I'd read about. Their presence here, in the dead of night, could only mean one thing: they were engaged in a ritual. The chanting grew louder, and the sound of a drumbeat echoed through the woods. I knew then that my solitude had been shattered. I retreated silently from the cabin, heart hammering in my chest. The cult was close, and I was completely unprepared to face them. Back at the RV, I attempted to restart the generator, my hands trembling as I fiddled with the stubborn wires. But every effort was futile. The RV's power remained dead, its interior succumbing to the thick darkness. I realized with a sinking feeling that my only option was to abandon the vehicle and seek help. I stuffed my journal, the map, and a few essential tools into a backpack, and with a final reluctant glance at the place that had promised solace but now promised terror, I slipped silently into the forest. Navigating the moonlit trails, I moved quickly yet cautiously. The forest, which had once seemed like a peaceful escape, had become a labyrinth of treachery. Every step was fraught with the fear of being discovered by those masked figures. I recalled the hermit's warning, how the old ways still held sway here, and cursed my decision to come so deep into these cursed woods alone. As I traversed an overgrown path, the rhythmic chanting of the cult grew louder, their voices blending with the nocturnal chorus of the forest. The map in my hand became my only guide. I clutched it tightly as I navigated the twisting trails, my senses heightened by a mix of adrenaline and terror. I could hear the crunch of leaves behind me, footsteps that matched my pace, a silent, relentless pursuit. At one point, I stumbled upon a clearing illuminated by a sickly, unnatural glow. In the center of the clearing, a makeshift altar had been constructed, piled high with animal bones and tattered remnants of cloth. Around the altar, several cult members knelt in fervent prayer, their heads bowed as they chanted in a language I couldn't understand. The sight was grotesque and otherworldly, a perverse mockery of ancient rituals. I ducked behind a fallen log, my breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. The cult's leader, a gaunt figure with eyes that burned with fanatic intensity, rose from the altar and began to pace slowly along the perimeter of the clearing. He carried a ceremonial dagger, its blade glinting in the eerie light. Every so often, he would glance in my direction, as if sensing my presence. I pressed myself further into the shadows, my heart pounding in my ears as I struggled to remain silent. I realized that this was not a mere gathering. It was a ritual in progress, one that involved violence and the promise of unspeakable acts. My mind raced with questions. Had I been followed all along, drawn into their circle by fate or misfortune? Was there any way out of this nightmare? I had come seeking redemption and solitude, but now I was ensnared in a web of ancient savagery. My thoughts turned inward, battling the deep-seated regrets that had driven me into the forest. Now they seemed as distant as a life I could barely remember. With a surge of determination, I knew that my only chance was to break free and find help. I waited until the cult's attention was momentarily diverted by some part of their ritual, and then I bolted from the clearing. My footsteps thundered over the leaf-strewn ground as I ran blindly through the darkened forest, branches whipping past my face and the distant sound of enraged chants echoing behind me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, every nerve on edge as I evaded detection by the cult. I clutched the backpack as if it were a lifeline, feeling the weight of my journal and map that had become the record of my own descent into terror. Finally, after what felt like hours in a frantic blur, I emerged onto a narrow, abandoned road. Dawn was just beginning to edge the horizon with pale light. Exhausted and trembling, I flagged down a passing car, a miracle in the midst of my nightmare. The driver, a kindly middle-aged woman, took me to a small town on the outskirts of the forest where I could seek refuge and report what I had witnessed. The local sheriff listened to my harrowing tale with a mix of skepticism and concern, his eyes darkening as I recounted the ritual, the cult, and the savage echoes of ancient curses. They promised to investigate, but I knew that the remnants of that dark night would remain etched in my memory forever. In the days that followed, I struggled to reconcile my experience with the rational world I once believed in. The face of the gaunt cult leader, the rhythmic chants, and the sight of that grotesque altar haunted my every waking moment. I revisited the map and journal entries I had made in the dead of night, piecing together fragments of a reality that blurred the line between myth and savagery. I realized that the isolation I had once craved had opened me to the brutal truths that lie hidden in the darkest corners of our world. Now, I sit in a quiet corner of my modest apartment, the remnants of that cursed forest and its ancient rites still reverberating in my mind. I write this account not merely as a recounting of events, but as a reminder, a testament to the thin line that separates civilization from the raw, unbridled savagery that still lurks in the forgotten backwoods of North Carolina. My journey into the dark woods stripped me of my illusions of control and isolation, replacing them with a stark understanding of my vulnerability and the primal forces that shape our world. I have come to realize that redemption, solitude, and peace are not found in fleeing from the past, but in confronting it, even when the past takes the form of masked figures in a night-shrouded clearing, chanting in a language older than time. My story, as painful as it is a chronicle of survival, a record of my struggle against the relentless tide of human cruelty and ancient curses. It is a reminder that sometimes in our darkest moments, we are forced to confront not only the terror outside, but also the shadows within ourselves. Though I have returned to a semblance of normality, the memory of that night lingers like a phantom. Every rustle in the wind, every unexpected shadow in the corner of my eye, brings me back to those moments when the forest was not a sanctuary but a living, breathing nightmare. And yet, in the midst of that terror, I discovered something vital, a deep, unsettling truth about the nature of isolation, the dangers of forgotten traditions, and the resilience of the human spirit when pushed to the brink. This is my tale of the dark woods, a journey into a realm where modernity collides with the primordial, where solitude becomes a battleground, and where survival demands that we confront the darkest parts of our past and our world. I share my experience in the hope that others will heed the warnings hidden in the carvings on ancient trees, in the hushed voices of reclusive hermits, and in the relentless echoes of chants that rise from the heart of the forest. For in those dark corners, the line between civilization and savagery is perilously thin, and the price of ignorance can be far too high. And so I continue to write, to remember, and to survive, forever changed by a night in the dark woods that I will never forget. My name is Avery, and I'm 34 years old. This happened in the fall of 2023 when my friends and I decided to leave behind the chaos of our daily lives for a weekend escape into the ancient wilds of Lynnville Gorge, North Carolina. I'd always believed in logic over superstition, but nothing could have prepared me for what we were about to face. It started as a routine RV camping trip, a chance for 4 friends to reconnect with nature and, perhaps, with ourselves. I was the one naturally taking charge, the practical, no-nonsense leader who believed that even the strangest local legends were nothing more than stories. With me were Sarah, whose intuitive sensitivity had always set her apart; Mike, ever the skeptic with a dry wit and a penchant for dismissing anything supernatural; and Jessica, a fiercely determined soul whose protectiveness often masked a deep-seated vulnerability rooted in a past that still haunted her. We loaded up my slightly beat-up RV, which had seen better days, and hit the road early one crisp October morning. The engine coughed and sputtered a few times, a reminder that our equipment was as unreliable as the weather. Despite these minor hiccups, our spirits were high. Sarah and Jessica filled the ride with stories of local folklore, tales of ancient curses, and eerie apparitions that supposedly roamed the forests of North Carolina. Mike laughed off these tales, calling them nothing more than exaggerated campfire stories. I listened with a mixture of amusement and cautious curiosity, not quite believing, but not dismissing the possibility that there might be more to these legends than met the eye. After a long drive through winding mountain roads and past breathtaking vistas, we finally arrived at our destination, a secluded clearing on the edge of Lynnville Gorge. The rugged terrain and towering trees lent the area an almost primeval quality. The RV's engine whined again as we settled in, and I couldn't help but worry that the unreliable equipment might become a more serious issue later. But in that moment, the promise of adventure outweighed any concerns. The first night in our temporary home under the stars was oddly quiet. Too quiet. As dusk fell and the sky turned a deep shade of indigo, the silence was punctuated by a series of low, guttural sounds emanating from the forest. At first, we attributed them to the wind rustling through the leaves, but then a disembodied, childlike laughter echoed in the distance. It was as if a ghost from a long-forgotten past was playing tricks on our senses. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to remain composed. After all, I was the leader, and I needed to keep a steady head for the sake of the group. Sarah was the first to voice her unease. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide and searching the dark woods. Mike scoffed. "Probably just a raccoon or some critter. You know how you get spooked over nothing." Jessica, however, was unusually quiet, her gaze fixed on the shadowy tree line as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. I decided to check the RV's generator, which had been acting up intermittently all day. The electrical failures were a nuisance, and the flickering lights inside only added to the creeping sense of dread. While fiddling with the wires, I noticed something that made my heart pound: a series of crudely carved symbols on a piece of driftwood propped against the wall. The markings were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They resembled ancient indigenous markings, steeped in mystery and, according to local lore, associated with curses and malevolent spirits. I called the others over, and together we examined the strange symbols. Sarah's voice trembled as she explained. These look like the symbols I read about in that book on local legends. They're said to be warnings of something that should never be disturbed. The conversation was abruptly cut short by a sudden, violent banging on the side of the RV. We all jumped, hearts racing. I motioned for silence, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it an animal, a prank, or something far more sinister? Mike cracked a nervous smile. Maybe it's just the wind playing tricks. But even he couldn't mask the tremor in his voice. That night, sleep was a luxury none of us could afford. As I lay in the narrow berth of the RV, I found myself unable to ignore the persistent feeling that we were being watched. Every creak and groan of the old vehicle seemed amplified in the darkness, each sound a potential harbinger of doom. I drifted in and out of restless sleep, my dreams filled with fleeting images of shadowy figures and a looming, malevolent presence that stalked our every move. The next morning, as the pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, we decided to explore the immediate area in hopes of finding an explanation for the strange occurrences. We hiked a short trail near the RV and discovered more unsettling signs. Additional symbols carved into tree bark, arranged in patterns that hinted at ritualistic significance. One carving in particular, a spiraling pattern intersected by jagged lines, seemed to pulse with an almost tangible sense of menace. The weight of indigenous lore pressed down on us, and even Mike, who had laughed off our concerns just a day earlier, could not hide his apprehension. That afternoon, as we sat around a small campfire trying to regain some semblance of normalcy, the forest around us seemed to come alive. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in an eerie, almost musical cadence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something moving. A humanoid silhouette with an unnaturally fluid gait disappearing into the thick underbrush. I called out, but no one else seemed to notice. Jessica was the first to break the silence. "I saw it too," she murmured, her voice a mixture of fear and determination. "It looked like a person, but not a person. It moved like it was in pain, like it was possessed." As the day wore on, our unease grew into palpable tension. Our conversation turned from tentative curiosity to outright dread. Sarah, her sensitive nature now bordering on hysteria, insisted that the symbols were a warning, a sign that we had unknowingly trespassed on sacred ground. Mike, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize it away, but even he couldn't fully dismiss the increasing occurrences of strange sounds and fleeting, shadowy figures that flitted at the edge of our vision. That night, the supernatural forces we had only suspected revealed themselves in full. As darkness fell, a cold, oppressive presence settled over the clearing. We heard a cacophony of sounds, twisted, guttural voices, the rustling of leaves that sounded almost like whispering, and that haunting, childlike laughter which now seemed to come from every direction. The RV's generator sputtered and died, plunging us into complete darkness. In the frantic beam of our flashlights, we caught sight of a figure, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in an aura of malevolence, moving deliberately toward the RV. Its eyes glowed with an eerie intensity, and its movements were unnaturally fluid, as if it were both human and something else entirely. In that moment, the legends Sarah had mentioned came rushing back. I remembered stories of a cursed spirit, a guardian of the land twisted by ancient injustice into a vengeful force. This entity, a hybrid of indigenous curse and the macabre lore of skinwalkers and wendigo, was now stalking us. The creature was not content to simply haunt from a distance. It was violent, and it was hunting. I ordered everyone to remain calm and barricade the RV doors, though I knew it was a temporary measure at best. As we huddled together in the cramped space, the creature attacked with a sudden, ferocious force. The RV shuddered under the impact of unseen blows, and a guttural roar reverberated through the night. We scrambled to secure anything that might serve as a weapon. Mike, his earlier bravado now replaced by sheer terror, muttered frantic reassurances that it was all just a bad dream, but the evidence of our predicament was undeniable. Scratches appeared along the side of the RV, and deep gouges marred the exterior where the creature had struck. Desperation set in. Jessica, whose courage had always been our anchor, took charge of devising a plan to escape. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice firm despite the chaos. "We can't stay in this RV if that thing's coming for us." Sarah, eyes wide with fear, clutched at a small pouch of sage and whispered, I think we need to try what the legends say, ward it off with these rituals." I nodded, knowing that in our desperate state, even the most superstitious methods were worth a try. We gathered what supplies we could find: makeshift talismans fashioned from local twigs and stones, bundles of sage, and a few old prayer cards that Jessica's grandmother had given her years ago. As the creature circled outside, its presence a constant reminder of the terror lurking beyond our fragile sanctuary, we began our improvised ritual. Sarah led us in a series of whispered prayers, her voice trembling but resolute. Mike, still in shock, clung to his skepticism as if it were a shield, while I focused on the task at hand, my mind racing to devise a way to repel the malevolent force. For what felt like hours, we battled the supernatural presence. The creature's assaults grew more frantic, its strikes more violent, as if it were angered by our attempts at defense. The RV's walls bore fresh marks of its fury, and each passing minute deepened the sense that we were fighting not just for our lives, but for our very souls. At one point, a particularly vicious blow sent Jessica crashing against the interior of the RV. I rushed to her side, my heart pounding as I saw that she had taken a deep cut on her arm. "Hold on," I urged, though deep inside I feared that our escape might come at too high a cost. In the midst of the chaos, I recalled the indigenous lore that Sarah had mentioned earlier. The story of a cursed guardian, a spirit of retribution born of old wrongs. The markings, the symbols we'd seen on the trees, all pointed to a deep, ancient anger that had been awakened by our intrusion. With a surge of determination, I directed the others to intensify our efforts. "We have to show it that we respect this land," I shouted over the cacophony of its howls. "Maybe then it'll leave us in peace." But the spirit was not a being to be placated with words or rituals. It lunged at the RV with a final, devastating force. In the ensuing struggle, as chaos reigned and every instinct screamed to survive, Jessica made a split-second decision. In a moment that will forever be etched in my memory, she shoved me toward the back of the RV and ran toward the narrow gap between the trees, a gap that might lead to safety, or at least a chance to escape the relentless horror. "Go! Get help!" she cried, her voice breaking with both fear and resolve. I hesitated for a heartbeat, knowing that if I didn't follow her lead, we would all be consumed by the darkness. With a final, pained glance back, I did the only thing I could. I ran. I dashed through the thick underbrush, guided only by the erratic beam of my flashlight and the distant, agonized sounds of Jessica's sacrifice. The forest was alive with the sounds of pursuit. Branches snapping, the heavy measured footsteps of our pursuer, and the distant echoing wails that sent shivers down my spine. Every step felt like a battle against time, as the oppressive presence of the spirit closed in around me. Hours later, when I finally emerged onto a rugged trail, I collapsed in exhaustion. The adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a numbing shock and a deep, gnawing sorrow for the loss of Jessica. My phone, battered and nearly dead, flickered with a weak signal, and I managed to call the local ranger station. The voice on the other end was dismissive, chalking up my story to stress-induced hallucinations. But I knew the truth. I had seen and felt the wrath of an ancient evil. I was eventually picked up by a local patrol. But even as I recounted the events, I was met with skeptical glances and a few hushed murmurs among the officers. They noted the scratches on my clothes, the torn fabric of my jacket, and the raw, haunted look in my eyes. No one believed that the legends of Lynnville Gorge could manifest into such a tangible, violent threat. I was left with the bitter knowledge that some ancient curses do not simply fade away. They remain, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. Back at home, the nightmares continued. Every creak of my floorboards, every flicker of a light, reminded me of that night in the woods. I couldn't shake the memory of Jessica's brave face, etched with determination even as she sacrificed herself so that I might survive. Mike and Sarah tried to move on, but the bonds we had forged under that cursed sky remained, a reminder of how fragile life can be when confronted with the inexplicable horrors of nature and the supernatural. I still drive by Lynnville Gorge now and then, a pilgrimage of sorts, to see if I can find any remnants of that night. Traces of the symbols carved into the trees, echoes of the laughter that once haunted our camp, but the forest remains silent, as if guarding its secrets with a timeless, indifferent resolve. In the aftermath, I've come to understand that survival is not just about physical escape, but about coming to terms with the darkness that sometimes lurks both outside and within us. The experience changed me irrevocably. I learned that the legends of this land are not mere stories told to scare children, but echoes of a history filled with pain, injustice, and a need for retribution. The spirit that hunted us was not a mindless monster. It was a manifestation of an ancient wrong, a curse born out of centuries of suffering and exploitation. Now, when I write in my journal or speak to those who will listen, I do so with a somber respect for the power of nature and the unseen forces that govern it. I know that I may never fully escape the memory of that night, nor the lingering question of whether the evil I encountered still roams the dark recesses of Lynnville Gorge, waiting for another intrusion. As I close this chapter of my story, I do so with a heavy heart and a resolve to honor the sacrifices made that night. Jessica's bravery, Sarah's sensitivity, and even Mike's reluctant acceptance of the truth have all left an indelible mark on my soul. The wilderness taught me that isolation can bring out the worst in both nature and humanity, and that sometimes, to survive, we must embrace the terrifying unknown, even if it costs us dearly. I am Avery, a man forever changed by the shadows of Lynnville Gorge. And as long as the ancient woods stand, the whispers of the past will continue to echo through the trees, a constant reminder that some legends are born of truth, and that the darkness we fear may be closer than we ever dare to imagine. My name is Tyler Johnson. I'm 28 years old, and this happened in the fall of 2023 when my thirst for adventure and a touch of recklessness drew me, along with two of my closest friends, deep into the backwoods of Black Mountain near Asheville, North Carolina. It began as the perfect weekend escape from the monotony of my daily routine. Melissa Parker, the ever-practical voice of reason, and Dave Thompson, whose anxiety often bordered on paranoia, joined me on what we expected to be a thrilling yet relaxing RV camping trip. I had been planning this excursion for months, excited by the lure of unexplored trails and the promise of rugged wilderness. The RV I managed to scrounge up was far from state-of-the-art. A clunky, aging vehicle with a flickering dash and a radio that had given up long before we set off. But the imperfections only added to the sense of isolation we were eager to experience. We arrived at our chosen campsite just as dusk was beginning to paint the sky in shades of bruise and fire. The site was nestled among towering pines and twisted oaks, with the faint sound of a creek trickling nearby. Despite the worn-out equipment, I felt an electric thrill in the air, a silent promise of the extraordinary. After unloading our gear and setting up the RV as best as we could, Melissa immediately began checking our supplies. "We should have enough firewood and batteries, right?" she asked, her tone measured but with an undercurrent of concern. Dave, ever the cautious one, lingered near the edge of the clearing, eyes darting into the thick shadows beyond the makeshift campfire. I shrugged off his unease. "Relax, Dave. It's just nature, nothing to worry about," I replied, though I, too, couldn't ignore the strange symbols we'd noticed etched into the bark of a nearby tree. They were a bizarre mixture of Native American motifs and cryptic, almost modern warnings. I couldn't help but wonder if they were the handiwork of local vandals, or perhaps something older and far more sinister. That first night, as I lay in the back of the RV, the darkness outside seemed almost tangible. The failing generator hummed sporadically, casting weak, inconsistent light through the dusty windows. I tried to sleep, but my ears caught the soft sound of laughter, a light, almost playful giggle that echoed from somewhere beyond the trees. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the crackle of our dying fire. I lay still, listening, my heart thumping against my ribs as the sound grew fainter yet unmistakably human. In the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a faint rustling at the door. When I peered out, the cold, pre-dawn air revealed nothing but the dark silhouettes of trees. Still, a chill ran down my spine as I recalled the uneasy feeling from the night before. I nudged Dave awake, but he only mumbled incoherently, his eyes wide and fearful. By sunrise, Melissa had gathered us around a small portable table, determined to piece together any rational explanation for the strange occurrences. "It's probably just wildlife, or even some teenagers playing pranks," she reasoned, scanning our surroundings with a practiced eye. But Dave wasn't so easily convinced. "What if it's not just pranks? What if we're being watched?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on us, so I decided that we'd explore the area on foot to see if we could trace the origin of those mysterious sounds. With the morning light barely filtering through the mist, we set out along a narrow, winding trail that meandered into the heart of Black Mountain's forest. My dog, Duke, trotted happily ahead, his tail a metronome of normalcy in an otherwise unsettling landscape. It wasn't long before we encountered more signs that something was amiss. The symbols we'd seen the night before reappeared along the trail, larger and more deliberate this time. They were etched into trees with precision, as if by someone or something that had known exactly where to leave its mark. The markings evoked both reverence and warning, and as we moved deeper into the woods, the air itself seemed to thicken with a palpable sense of foreboding. The further we went, the more strained the dynamic among us became. I found myself clashing with Dave, whose growing paranoia contrasted sharply with my innate need for adventure. "We should turn back," he insisted repeatedly, his voice rising with each step. Melissa tried to mediate, urging us to keep calm and consider the possibility that our minds were playing tricks on us in the silence of the forest. But as I looked around, I couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that every rustle and whisper was leading us closer to something unimaginable. Around midday, we stumbled upon an abandoned clearing where the remnants of an old campsite lay scattered. The air here was unusually still, as if time itself had paused. A single dilapidated swing creaked in the distance, moving on its own accord. It was then that I noticed the first real sign of a presence beyond our understanding. A shadowy figure, barely visible between the trees, clad in tattered white. The figure was there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind only the echo of movement and a deep, resonant silence. I tried to call out, but my voice faltered in the oppressive quiet. Dave's face went ashen, and even Melissa's confident facade cracked with worry. We decided to return to the RV immediately, but the forest had begun to play tricks on us. Paths that were once familiar twisted into labyrinthine routes, and every step forward felt like a descent into a waking nightmare. Back at the RV, we attempted to fix the faulty radio, desperate to re-establish any link to the outside world. My hands trembled as I fiddled with the ancient controls, but all I got was static and occasional, unintelligible murmurs. In a moment of frustration, I slammed my fist against the dashboard, and the radio let out a burst of piercing feedback that sent our nerves into overdrive. That night, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The familiar sounds of the forest transformed into a disconcerting symphony, a chorus of whispers, distant cries, and what sounded like the faint, sorrowful hum of a woman singing. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the RV rattled under the weight of an unseen force. In the deep hours before dawn, I finally rose, driven by an inexplicable need to confront whatever haunted us. I crept outside, careful not to wake the others, and followed a trail of dim, flickering lights that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The lights led me to a clearing where the ghostly figure from earlier now stood more distinctly against the darkened forest. A woman in white, her eyes empty, her face a mask of grief and malevolence. Her presence was overwhelming. I felt her sorrow and fury, a duality that defied explanation. I could see that her eyes were not merely vacant, they were windows to a torment that had been inflicted upon her long ago. A story began to form in my mind, fragments of local legends and whispered tales of a brutal injustice inflicted upon an innocent woman, left to wander the woods as an echo of unspeakable sorrow. I stepped forward, my heart pounding, and tried to speak, to offer some form of solace or understanding. But before I could utter a word, she vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a silence that was both liberating and terrifying. In the days that followed, the supernatural presence grew bolder. Melissa spent hours researching local folklore at the small-town library in Black Mountain, piecing together the tragic history behind the ghost. According to ancient records and local oral histories, the apparition was once a woman wronged by those she trusted, a victim of betrayal and violence whose spirit now roamed the forests, seeking retribution or perhaps redemption. Dave's anxiety spiraled further. Every night, he claimed to see her reflection in the darkened windows of the RV, and he was convinced that her spectral wail would soon drive us all to madness. The tension among us became palpable, fraying the bonds of our friendship. I tried to be the brave leader, but even I found myself doubting my ability to face the unknown. One fateful night, as a violent storm raged outside, the RV shuddered under the force of lashing winds and pelting rain. We were huddled together in the cramped interior, each of us lost in our own thoughts and fears, when the unthinkable happened. The lights flickered and died, plunging us into near total darkness. In that moment, the sound of frantic footsteps, running, clattering over the metal floor, echoed down the narrow corridor. I bolted to the door, only to find that the storm had brought more than just water and wind. A figure, draped in remnants of white cloth, stood at the threshold. Her eyes, glowing faintly in the intermittent lightning, were filled with a burning intensity that spoke of endless torment. The confrontation was brief and violent. The ghost's presence seemed to shatter the already fragile barriers between our reality and something far darker. Dave, overcome by panic, bolted from the RV, leaving Melissa and me to face the entity alone. In the chaos, I scrambled to grab the radio, hoping to call for help, but the device only emitted a harsh, agonizing screech that drowned out any attempt at communication. Melissa, with a calm that belied the terror in her eyes, shouted, "Ty, we need to do something. Appease her, or we're done for." Her voice was steady, even as the wind howled and the ghost hovered inches away from us. I felt an inexplicable pull, as if the ghost's tragic energy was trying to force me to understand her pain. In that split second, I remembered one of the faded passages from the local legends, that offering understanding, perhaps even a gesture of compassion, might ease her tortured spirit. Gathering every ounce of courage, I spoke softly into the oppressive silence. "I know you're hurting. I know you were wronged," I said, my voice barely audible over the storm. "I can't bring back what was lost, but I promise, if you let us go, we'll remember your story, we'll honor you." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the spectral figure seemed to waver, her form softening as if touched by a distant warmth. The tension in the air eased just enough for me to believe that maybe, just maybe, our desperate plea had reached her. Melissa's eyes met mine, and in them I saw a spark of hope mingled with deep sorrow. But the reprieve was short-lived. The storm reached its peak and a violent gust slammed the RV door shut, trapping us inside. In that final act of nature's fury, the ghost's presence flared one last time. A searing pain shot through my head and I stumbled. Visions of past atrocities, of betrayal, injustice, and endless suffering assaulting my mind. The boundary between my reality and hers blurred, and for a moment, I could feel the weight of her centuries of sorrow. When I came to, Melissa was cradling my head, her eyes filled with tears. "Ty, we have to get out of here," she urged, her voice trembling yet determined. Dave, having returned to the RV amid the chaos, stood in the doorway with a look of abject terror. He muttered something about never leaving this cursed place again. In that desperate moment, we realized that our encounter had shifted from a haunting to a full-blown battle for survival. The spirit, though seemingly appeased for an instant, was now a force of nature, a manifestation of the deep, unhealed wounds of the past, and she was not going to let us escape without a price. With the RV's power still failing and the radio a useless conduit of static, we made a pact. We had to flee the campsite, venture back into the labyrinthine woods, and find any sign of civilization where we might call for help. The storm had passed into a relentless drizzle, and the forest was eerily silent, as if mourning the chaos that had unfolded. Our escape was fraught with peril. The paths we once knew had twisted into an alien maze, and the spectral presence seemed to stalk us from every shadow. At one point, as we navigated a particularly narrow trail, I caught sight of the ghost again. This time, she was not merely a lingering spirit. She moved with a deliberate, almost violent intent. Her form, now unmistakably that of a tortured soul, seemed to be leading us deeper into the darkness. I shouted for Melissa and Dave to stay close, but my voice was lost amid the whispers of the wind and the rustling of leaves that resembled anguished cries. Hours passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. We stumbled upon an old, abandoned ranger station hidden among the pines. It was decrepit, its windows shattered, and inside, dust and decay reigned supreme. We barricaded ourselves in a back room, desperate for any semblance of safety. There, huddled together on a creaking cot, we recounted our experiences, trying to make sense of the terror that had driven us from our once hopeful expedition. Melissa pulled out her notebook, the pages filled with frantic scribbles of local folklore and legends. "I found something," she said in a hushed tone, flipping to a passage that described a woman betrayed and murdered by those she trusted. "They say her spirit was cursed to wander these woods, never finding rest until her story was acknowledged." The weight of her words settled over us like a shroud. I realized then that our desperate plea in the storm had been our only hope, a fragile bridge between our world and hers. As night fell once again, we braced ourselves for what was to come. The ghost, it seemed, was not finished with us. Outside, the wind picked up, and faint whispers echoed through the broken windows of the ranger station. I lay awake, every nerve on edge, wondering if the spectral figure would once more manifest in violent retribution. At the break of dawn, our makeshift refuge was shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps and the scraping of metal against concrete. The door burst open, and in that moment of blinding morning light, I saw not only the ghost, but a throng of shadowy figures moving in unison among the trees, a macabre procession that blurred the lines between legend and reality. Their presence was an ominous reminder that in these woods, the past was not dead. It was a living, breathing force capable of both haunting and violence. With no other choice, we abandoned the ranger station and sprinted towards the sound of distant voices, perhaps human, perhaps something far worse. In the ensuing chaos, Dave was separated from us. I heard his panicked cries echoing as he was swallowed by the mist and the twisting corridors of the forest. My heart pounded in my ears as Melissa and I pressed on, each step driven by equal parts hope and dread. We had to find him, and we had to escape the relentless pull of this cursed land. In the final confrontation, standing beneath a towering pine that seemed to pierce the sky, the ghost appeared one last time. Her eyes, now filled with both sorrow and fury, locked onto mine. I could see in them the centuries of pain and injustice that had marked her existence. "Leave," I pleaded, my voice cracking with desperation. "Take your pain away from us. Let us go." For a heartbeat, the forest fell silent, and I believed I saw a flicker of understanding in her spectral gaze. Then, as if a final decision had been made, she raised her hand, and the forest around us erupted into a violent gust of wind. The power of nature itself seemed to tear at the fabric of the night, and the ghost receded, her form dissolving into the swirling mists. I don't know if it was an act of mercy or a final fatal warning, but in that moment, the oppressive weight of the supernatural lifted ever so slightly. Melissa and I eventually found Dave, shivering and disoriented but alive. We emerged from the forest at dawn, battered and broken, with the chilling knowledge that the legend of Black Mountain was all too real. Our journey back to civilization was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts, haunted by the echoes of that tragic spirit and the realization that some stories are born from truths too painful to forget. Even now, months later, as I recount the events that transpired during that fateful weekend, I struggle to reconcile the allure of adventure with the grim reality of the past. I learned that nature, with all its beauty and mystery, also holds secrets that are better left undisturbed. And while I may never fully understand the spectral woman in white and the tragic legacy she embodies, I carry her memory with me, a somber reminder that every step into the unknown may lead to a confrontation with history, sorrow, and the restless souls who linger in the dark. I now know that survival in the wild isn't just a test of physical endurance, but also of mental fortitude. It's about respecting the forces that have shaped the land for centuries, and acknowledging that some tragedies, no matter how deeply buried, refuse to rest. My name is Tyler Johnson, and I will never forget the night I came face to face with the echoes of Black Mountain, a night when the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred into a single, terrifying reality. My name is Lila Jenkins. I'm 42 years old, and this happened in the autumn of 2022, a time when I was desperate to escape the constant reminders of my past and seek a semblance of peace in isolation. I had spent years burdened by guilt and sorrow after the loss of my child and a painful divorce that left me feeling broken. In a final bid to reconcile with my inner demons, I loaded up my old, creaking RV and set off for a secluded spot near the Croatan National Forest in eastern North Carolina, drawn by the haunting beauty of a vast, misty marsh. The RV had seen better days. Its engine coughed to life with a sound that echoed my own uncertainty. Every rattling noise and flickering light seemed to mirror the instability that had defined my life for so long. Despite these imperfections, the RV was my only means of escape, a mobile sanctuary that I hoped would lead me to the solace I so desperately needed. After hours of driving along desolate roads and through patches of dense pine, I finally arrived at my destination. I had chosen a quiet clearing on the edge of a sprawling marsh, where the low, rhythmic lapping of water against the shore and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures set a gentle, if eerie, ambiance. The marsh was shrouded in a persistent mist that blurred the boundary between water and sky, lending the whole area an otherworldly quality. At first, I found a strange comfort in the isolation. The marsh, with its muted greens and grays, seemed to offer a quiet space where I could reflect on the past without the incessant noise of everyday life. I set up my modest camp beside the marsh's edge, taking note of the silence that enveloped everything. A silence that was both soothing and, at times, unnervingly oppressive. That first night, as I sat outside the RV watching the mist swirl over the water, I couldn't help but feel that I was being watched. I dismissed the sensation as the product of my own fraught emotions and the eerie quiet of the place. But as the darkness deepened, small, unsettling details began to intrude on my fragile sense of calm. It started with minor malfunctions in the RV. The lights flickered intermittently, and the old heater sputtered as though struggling against an unseen force. I attributed these problems to the age of the vehicle and the humid marsh air, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The technical glitches seemed to synchronize with inexplicable sounds, soft, almost imperceptible whispers carried on the wind, like the murmurs of a forgotten lament. During the second day, determined to distract myself from the creeping unease, I ventured out on foot to explore the area. Wandering along a narrow, muddy trail that wound through clusters of cypress trees and tangled reeds, I found myself drawn to an overgrown path that led to a small, dilapidated cabin hidden among the marsh grasses. The cabin's weathered wood and broken windows spoke of years of neglect and sorrow. My heart pounded as I approached it, a mix of dread and curiosity urging me forward. Inside, the musty smell of decay and disuse filled the air. Amid the debris and scattered remnants of a long-forgotten life, I discovered a battered diary. Its pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. As I began to read, I learned that the diary belonged to a woman who had once lived in this very place. A woman known in local lore as a grieving witch. The entries chronicled a tragic tale of loss. She had lost her own child and, overcome with despair, had been accused of cursing the marsh. The diary hinted at a curse that bound her sorrowful spirit to the land, condemning her to wander the marsh for eternity. The words leaped off the page, each entry resonating with my own deep-seated grief and guilt. I felt an inexplicable connection to the woman's anguish, as if her despair mirrored my own. The diary's cryptic passages hinted at a supernatural presence, a spirit born of sorrow and isolation, forever trapped in a cycle of mourning and regret. I clutched the diary tightly, feeling as though I'd uncovered a part of my own soul, long buried beneath layers of pain. That night, the atmosphere around my camp grew even more charged with an unseen energy. I sat in the dim light of the RV, reading the diary by the flicker of a dying lantern. Outside, the marsh seemed to pulse with life. I began to hear soft cries carried on the wind, half-heard sobs and whispered lullabies that stirred something deep within me. There were moments when I caught a glimpse of a figure in the periphery of my vision, a woman dressed in tattered garments, her face obscured by the haze of mist, moving silently along the water's edge. Each time I tried to focus on her, she would vanish, leaving only the unsettling feeling of loss in her wake. The spectral sightings and eerie sounds intensified over the following nights. Items in the RV, old photographs, a locket, even a small memento from my child, were inexplicably rearranged as if guided by an unseen hand. I began to feel that the spirit of the grieving witch was trying to communicate with me, reaching out from the shadows of the marsh. My nights were haunted by vivid dreams of a mother weeping by a murky stream, her face etched with unbearable sorrow. In these dreams, I was both the mourner and the witness, a dual presence caught between memory and nightmare. Every supernatural occurrence forced me to confront the guilt and grief that had long tormented me. I had tried to escape the pain by isolating myself in this remote place, but now it was as if the marsh and its resident spirit were compelling me to face what I had tried so hard to bury. The witch's story, inscribed in the fragile pages of her diary, resonated with my own experience of loss. I began to see her not as a malevolent force, but as a mirror of my own inner torment. A soul as desperate for absolution as I was. One stormy night, the pressure became too much to bear. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the sound of weeping that was almost human. Lightning illuminated the dark sky, casting long, jagged shadows over the marsh. I couldn't stand the oppressive energy any longer. Clutching the diary to my chest, I made my way back to the abandoned cabin, determined to confront the spirit that had haunted me since my arrival. Inside the decaying structure, I lit a single candle. Its small flame trembled in the drafty air as I recited the words I had found in the diary, a plea for forgiveness and a confession of my own deepest regrets. The words came out haltingly at first, then with a growing strength that surprised me. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the darkness, tears mingling with the rain that seeped through the broken roof. "I'm so sorry for the pain I've carried all these years. I forgive myself for the mistakes I've made." As if in response, the temperature in the room dropped, and the candle's flame flickered wildly. In the wavering light, I saw her, a spectral figure, half-formed and shrouded in sorrow. The ghostly apparition of the grieving witch stood before me, her eyes reflecting a profound sadness and a silent understanding. For a long, suspended moment, we simply stared at each other, two broken souls brought together by shared loss. Her expression was inscrutable, a mixture of anguish, regret, and something else that I couldn't quite decipher. In that quiet, charged silence, I felt the weight of my own guilt begin to lift. I realized that the witch's curse was not meant to torment others, but to hold her captive in her own sorrow. And perhaps in confronting her, I could find the redemption I so desperately sought. The spirit's eyes softened, and she extended a hand, her gesture both sorrowful and tender. I took a tentative step forward, my heart pounding in my chest, and placed my hand in hers. In that fleeting contact, a surge of warmth and relief flooded through me. A silent promise that healing was possible, even for the most scarred of hearts. The witch's form shimmered, and for a moment I saw not a specter of despair, but the tender face of a grieving mother who had finally found the strength to forgive. As the storm raged outside, the oppressive energy in the cabin began to dissipate. The spectral figure slowly faded into the darkness, leaving behind only the soft echoes of a lullaby and a sense of profound peace. I remained in the cabin long after the spirit had vanished, my heart lighter and my resolve steadier than it had been in years. I knew that this confrontation was only the beginning of my journey toward self-forgiveness. In the days that followed, the supernatural phenomena around my camp became less frequent. The haunting sounds and shifting objects gradually returned to the natural rhythm of the marsh. I spent my time restoring the old cabin, repairing broken windows, and sweeping away the dust of years gone by, a symbolic act of cleansing that mirrored the inner work I was undertaking. The diary remained with me, a constant reminder of the connection between our stories and of the possibility of redemption through acceptance. I repaired my RV with a renewed sense of purpose, fixing what I could and understanding that the imperfections in both the vehicle and myself were part of a larger, imperfect journey. Each day, as I ventured out along the misty banks of the marsh, I felt a growing sense of calm and acceptance. The witch's presence, once a harbinger of despair, had transformed into a quiet guardian, an echo of my own resilience and capacity for healing. When it was finally time to leave the secluded marsh behind, I felt a bittersweet pang. The experience had not erased the pain of my past, but it had reshaped my relationship to it. Driving away from the marsh, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the faded silhouette of the old cabin and the gentle, mist-covered expanse. I carried with me not just memories of loss and sorrow, but a deep, enduring hope that even the darkest chapters of our lives can lead to a new dawn. Now, as I write these words long after that transformative journey, I realize that the marsh and its haunting guardian have become a part of me. My name is Lila Jenkins, and I am no longer defined solely by my grief and guilt. I have learned that confronting one's inner demons, whether through supernatural encounters or the quiet introspection of solitude, can open the door to forgiveness and self-compassion. Every time I pass by a quiet, misty marsh or see a dilapidated cabin standing resilient against the passage of time, I am reminded of that stormy night and the gentle, sorrowful spirit who showed me that healing is possible. The supernatural events that once filled me with terror have become the catalyst for my rebirth. A vivid reminder that even in the depths of isolation, redemption can bloom like a delicate flower amid the reeds. And so, I continue my journey through life with a heart a little lighter, a soul a little less burdened, and a determination to embrace every imperfection along the way. My past will always be a part of me, but I now know that I have the strength to forgive, to let go, and to move forward into a future where the echoes of grief are transformed into whispers of hope. This is not a tale of horror in the traditional sense. There were no gruesome murders or relentless monsters in the darkness. Instead, it is a story of inner confrontation, of the ghosts we carry within us, and of the power of forgiveness to set us free. In that remote marsh near Croatan National Forest, I faced a supernatural presence that was as real as my own pain. And in doing so, I found the courage to finally forgive myself and to let the past rest beneath the gentle, eternal mists of memory. My journey taught me that sometimes the most profound encounters are not with creatures of myth, but with the very parts of ourselves that we have long tried to hide away. And as I drive down winding country roads with the sun setting in the distance, I am reminded of that stormy night. The night when the marsh of memories became a place of healing, and when the ghost of a grieving witch helped me rediscover the beauty of forgiveness. My name is Daniel Danny Roberts. I'm 35 years old, and this happened in the late summer of 2023. A weekend trip that was meant to be an escape, but quickly turned into a fight for survival against something beyond human comprehension. I've always loved the wild, uncharted corners of North Carolina, and when the idea of an RV trip to Serenity Hollow in the Blue Ridge Mountains first popped into my head, I knew I had to seize the chance. I was the de facto leader of our little group, a title I'd earned from years of adventure and outdoor expeditions. With me on this trip were 3 other friends whose personalities couldn't be more different. There was Emily Carter, a sensitive soul with an uncanny ability to pick up on the slightest shifts in the air. Mark Holloway, a cynical city dweller whose rationality was often at odds with the mysteries of nature. And Jenna Morales, the meticulous planner who had mapped out every detail of our journey. We set off in my old RV, a beaten-up rig that had seen better days. Even before we reached our destination, the RV was proving to be as unreliable as my hope for a stress-free getaway. On the drive up the narrow back roads that wound through the Blue Ridge, the engine coughed and spluttered, and the generator made a persistent whining noise that set my nerves on edge. But we pressed on. Our destination, Serenity Hollow, promising solace and breathtaking views far from the chaos of our daily lives. It was around dusk on our first day when the unease began to settle over us like a thick, unyielding fog. We had parked in a clearing not far from a gently murmuring river, its waters reflecting the dying light of the sun. I remember stepping out of the RV and feeling the weight of silence pressing against my ears. There was something off about the atmosphere, a palpable stillness that made every rustle in the trees seem amplified, every creak of the old RV a forewarning of impending doom. That evening, as we gathered around a modest campfire, Emily's voice trembled as she recounted local legends of the Blue Ridge. "They say there's a spirit out here," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously into the darkening woods. "Something ancient, a wendigo-like presence, born of isolation and despair. I know it sounds like myth, but I can feel it, like a cold spot that follows me even when I'm alone." Mark scoffed at the idea, his laugh brittle. "Legends, Emily. Just stories to scare kids." Jenna, ever the mediator, reminded us that caution was prudent regardless of folklore. Sleep that night was restless. I lay awake listening to the groan of the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. The RV's generator sputtered intermittently, casting eerie shadows across the cramped interior. My mind churned with doubts and unease, but I told myself it was just the RV. Old, temperamental, and nothing more. It wasn't long before the first unmistakable signs of something wrong emerged. The next morning, while Jenna and I were checking on the RV's equipment, we discovered a set of large elongated footprints pressed into the muddy ground near the rear of the vehicle. They were far too deep and irregular to belong to any animal we'd known roaming these parts. "Danny, look at these," Jenna said, her voice low and trembling. "This isn't normal." I knelt beside the prints, my heart pounding as I tried to rationalize the impossibility of such marks. I brushed off the damp soil with my boot, feeling a shiver crawl up my spine. That afternoon, we decided to explore the nearby trails, hoping to shake off the disquiet that had taken root. Mark led the way, his skepticism a shield against the eerie sensations that clung to the forest. But as we hiked deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier. A dense, unnatural fog rolled in, swallowing the trail and distorting familiar landmarks. I found myself glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking just out of sight. The first sign that our rationalizations might not hold true came when we heard it. A faint, childlike laughter echoing through the trees. It was delicate and high-pitched, almost like the giggle of a small child, but its tone carried an underlying note of despair. Emily stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you all hear that?" she whispered. The others nodded in uneasy silence, the sound lingering in our ears long after it had faded into the hum of the forest. That night, back at the RV, tensions began to fray. I took the helm, trying to assure everyone that we were simply dealing with equipment issues and environmental quirks. Yet, even as I spoke, the RV shuddered violently, as if struck by a powerful force from outside. We huddled together in the cramped space, the very walls seeming to close in on us. Mark, ever the skeptic, muttered about faulty wiring, but his words lacked conviction. The atmosphere turned even more oppressive when we discovered more unsettling signs around the RV. Tools and personal items were inexplicably rearranged in what appeared to be a ritualistic pattern just outside our door. I remember the pounding on the metal exterior, the sound of something trying to break in, accompanied by a deep, guttural roar that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the lock. As the hours dragged on, it became clear that we were no longer dealing with mere bad luck or faulty equipment. Whatever was out there was watching us, its presence a dark specter that defied explanation. It seemed to toy with our senses, vanishing into the fog one moment and reappearing as a fleeting silhouette at the edge of our vision the next. Emily's anxiety deepened, and even Mark's dismissive attitude began to crumble in the face of undeniable terror. In a desperate bid to understand what we were up against, Jenna proposed that we document everything. Every sound, every strange footprint, every inexplicable movement. I hesitated, knowing that recording these events might only serve to seal our fate, but there was a method to her madness. If we can prove something was here, she argued, maybe someone will believe us, or at least we'll know what we're dealing with. We agreed, though the uneasy silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears. That uneasy alliance was soon tested when, on our third night, the true horror made itself known. I was awakened by the sound of frantic pounding at the RV door. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to the window and peered into the darkness. There, amid the swirling fog, I saw a figure, pale, gaunt, and impossibly tall, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. It stood motionless for a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity before lurching forward with a speed that defied reason. "Everyone, wake up!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. I could hear footsteps pounding on the ground outside, heavy and deliberate, as if something was circling us. The creature's presence was overwhelming, an oppressive force that pressed down on our very souls. Emily clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror, while Mark's usual skepticism was replaced by a palpable dread. Jenna scrambled to gather whatever makeshift barricades we could muster, reinforcing windows and doors with furniture and tools. The creature did not break in immediately. Instead, it lingered, as if savoring our terror. I could hear its ragged breaths punctuated by low guttural murmurs that seemed to echo the words of an ancient curse. In that moment, every story we had dismissed as folklore came rushing back in horrifying clarity. The Wendigo legend, twisted and reimagined over time, now embodied in a being that was both predator and tormentor. Our collective fear was compounded by the harsh reality of our situation. The RV, our supposed sanctuary, was quickly proving inadequate against an enemy that defied the natural order. The old generator, which had already been unreliable, now sputtered ominously, its intermittent power casting our surroundings into a disjointed tapestry of light and shadow. I knew that if we stayed in the RV any longer, our chances of survival would dwindle with every passing moment. In a moment of desperate clarity, I made the decision that none of us wanted to confront. We had to leave. "We can't stay here," I declared, my voice steady despite the terror surging inside me. "We need to abandon the RV and head into the forest, get to higher ground." Mark's eyes darted around in disbelief. "Are you insane? That thing out there, it's not just going to let us go." But the alternative was worse. Jenna, ever pragmatic, nodded in agreement, and even Emily, though trembling, managed a quiet yes. We hastily gathered what we could: flashlights, a first aid kit, a few bags of supplies, and prepared to abandon the false safety of the RV. As we stepped out into the cold, clammy night, the oppressive presence of the creature made every step feel like a descent into madness. The forest was a labyrinth of twisting paths and impenetrable darkness, the fog reducing our vision to mere feet ahead. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf felt like a prelude to an attack. We tried to move quietly, hoping that our careful tread might keep us hidden, but the creature seemed to know our every move. At one point, Mark, who had been leading the way with reluctant determination, stopped abruptly. I think I lost it," he stammered, eyes scanning the murk. The sound of distant, agonized cries filled the air, childlike wails that sent shivers down our spines. I couldn't help but think of Emily's earlier warning that something was not just watching us, but actively haunting us. Our escape turned into a frantic run. The forest became a surreal maze where time seemed to warp, and every branch threatened to tear us apart. I could hear the relentless pounding behind us, as if the creature was chasing us with a single-minded fury. In the chaos, Jenna tripped over a root, and I lunged to help her up, only to feel a searing pain along my arm, a deep, ragged claw mark that seared with an intensity that defied explanation. Blood and fear mingled as we continued our desperate dash, our breaths ragged in the cold night air. The creature was relentless, its pursuit marked by sudden, terrifying stops and starts. At one point, it caught up to us, and I saw it in full. An abomination of nature, with elongated limbs, skin stretched tight over gaunt bones, and eyes that burned with a malevolent light. It moved with a disturbing grace, its movements both animalistic and eerily human. In that moment of confrontation, survival instincts overrode everything else. "Run!" I screamed, pushing Jenna and Mark ahead as I tried to shield Emily, who was now sobbing in terror. The creature lunged, its clawed hand grazing my back as I staggered. Pain exploded through me, and I fell to the forest floor, the cold earth a harsh welcome. I scrambled to rise, my vision blurring as I watched the creature circle, as if deliberating its next move. Time slowed. I could see the fear in each of my friends' eyes, the realization that we were up against something far beyond human cruelty. I managed to force myself back to my feet, adrenaline drowning out the pain in my arm. "Keep moving," I urged, my voice ragged with both pain and determination. The chase was chaotic, a blur of twisted branches, fog, and desperate shouts. I lost track of how long we ran. At one point, it felt like we had been pursued for miles, our hearts pounding in unison with the monster's unyielding rhythm. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pursuit seemed to falter. We paused in a small clearing, panting and bloodied, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the creature. That brief pause was our only moment to catch our breath and assess the damage. Mark, who had sustained several scratches, was leaning against a tree, his earlier skepticism completely eroded by the terror of what he had witnessed. Jenna was meticulously checking our supplies, trying to salvage what little hope we had left, while Emily sat huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with disbelief. I tended to my arm, feeling the raw sting of each heartbeat, and realized that we had all changed in that relentless night. We were no longer simply a group of friends on an RV retreat. We were survivors in a hostile, alien wilderness where the line between myth and reality had been irrevocably blurred. The creature, this wendigo-like spirit, had made its intentions clear. It was not a mindless specter. It was a malevolent force that fed on fear, despair, and the fragility of human life. It had stalked us, terrorized us, and even inflicted wounds meant to remind us of its presence. In the desperate hours that followed, we made a temporary camp in that clearing. The darkness pressed in, and every sound in the forest seemed amplified, a constant reminder that we were not safe. I took stock of our situation. We had a wound that needed cleaning and bandaging, and the cold bite of the night was unrelenting. But more than that, we had to decide our next move. The RV, our initial haven, was now a tomb of memories and a symbol of our failed attempts to shield ourselves from the unknown. After a long, sleepless night filled with whispered plans and quiet prayers, we resolved to make one final stand. We fortified our makeshift camp as best we could, gathering debris and old planks to create a barrier. I took on the role of lookout, armed with nothing more than a flashlight and a resolve hardened by terror. The creature's earlier attack had shown that it was both violent and cunning. We could only hope that if we managed to hold it off long enough, daylight would bring clarity and perhaps a way out. In those tense, silent hours before dawn, every one of us grappled with the raw reality of our situation. Mark, whose skepticism had nearly blinded him to the supernatural forces at work, now muttered incessant apologies to the night for doubting what he had seen. Emily, tears drying on her cheeks, whispered prayers and repeated words of reassurance to herself. Jenna methodically reviewed our dwindling supplies, noting every detail in her ever-present notebook, as if writing might somehow stitch our fragmented reality back together. As the first pale hints of dawn crept over the horizon, the forest seemed to hold its breath. I was on watch when a low, mournful cry broke the silence, a sound that echoed like the wail of lost souls. The creature was out there, restless and provoked, its presence palpable in the shifting shadows. My pulse hammered in my ears as I watched the darkness recede, revealing more of the battered landscape. I knew this was not the end. It was merely a pause in a night that had turned our lives upside down. In the light of day, we cautiously emerged from our makeshift barricade, our eyes scanning for any sign of the creature. The forest was eerily quiet, the normal sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent. We retraced our steps toward the abandoned RV, the metal frame scarred by claw marks and battered by what now seemed to be an intentional assault. It was here, amid the ruin of our earlier refuge, that the final confrontation came unexpectedly. I remember it as if it were etched into my memory in permanent relief. While examining the perimeter of the RV, Jenna screamed, a piercing sound that shattered the tentative calm. I spun around to see a figure emerging from the tree line. This time, there was no hesitation. The creature moved with a ferocity that defied all our attempts at rationalization. In a moment of blinding terror, it lunged at us with a speed that left little time for reaction. In the chaos, I fought to shield my friends, my instincts screaming that this was the moment of reckoning. The creature's assault was brutal. It tore at the fabric of our reality, its claws slashing through the air with a predatory precision. I felt the sting of its assault on my body, pain lancing through my arm once again, and I could see the fear etched on each of my friends' faces. Emily's scream mingled with Mark's desperate shouts, and Jenna's eyes were filled with a resolve that I could only admire. The struggle was a blur, moments of desperate violence punctuated by the relentless beating of our hearts. In the melee, I managed to grab a heavy piece of debris and swing it with all my might. The impact was enough to momentarily stagger the creature, its momentum faltering as it recoiled in a pained snarl. But this reprieve was fleeting. The creature's eyes flared with an unholy light, and it advanced once more, driven by an insatiable hunger for our fear. I knew then that survival was not just about physical escape, but also about confronting the darkness that dwelled both within and without. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I rallied my friends. "We fight together," I shouted, my voice echoing in the dismal forest. In that split second, our collective determination crystallized into action. Mark found a makeshift weapon, a sturdy branch, and together we managed to hold the creature at bay long enough for Jenna to retrieve our remaining supplies and for Emily to help tend to my injured arm. The final moments of the confrontation were a whirlwind of desperate energy and raw terror. The creature, wounded and enraged, let out one final, soul-shattering roar before retreating into the shadows, its presence lingering like a curse over the land. When the forest finally fell silent, we were left battered, bruised, and forever changed. In the aftermath, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, we gathered ourselves in the clearing, leaning on one another for support. We knew that whatever had attacked us was not entirely vanquished. It had retreated, waiting for another moment of vulnerability. Yet, in that grim dawn, we also recognized the strength we had forged together in the crucible of our terror. Over the following days, we trekked through the forest, each step a reminder of the night's horror. The incident had left scars not only on our bodies, but deep within our minds. Mark, once the staunch skeptic, now carried a solemn respect for the unknown. Emily's once fragile sensitivity had transformed into a wary vigilance, and Jenna's careful planning had taken on a new urgency, a recognition that no amount of preparation could fully shield one from the inexplicable forces that lurk in the dark corners of the world. By the time we finally emerged from the forest and flagged down a passing local for help, I felt the weight of our ordeal like a shroud. The authorities, though sympathetic, had little explanation for the events we described, a collision of ancient legend and modern terror. Our story became another whispered myth among the locals, a cautionary tale of a spirit that haunted the Blue Ridge, preying on those who dared seek solace in its isolated wilderness. Now, as I write these words in the safety of my home, the memories of that night remain vivid. The creature, the wendigo-like presence born of indigenous lore and the twisted power of human despair, has not been vanquished. It lingers in the backwoods, in the shadow of every tree and the whisper of every wind, waiting for the next unwary traveler to cross its path. I am forever changed by that encounter. I learned that sometimes the greatest dangers are not those we can see or understand, but the ones that lie hidden in the depths of our own fears. That night, as we fought for our lives, we discovered not only the terror of an ancient evil, but also the strength of our bond, a strength forged in the crucible of survival, where every heartbeat was a testament to the will to live. My name is Daniel Danny Roberts. I'm 35, and I will never forget the night we faced the darkness in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In that timeless, haunted forest, we learned that the line between myth and reality is as thin as the mist that shrouds the trees, and that sometimes the true horror lies in the things we dare not explain. And so I share this story not to glorify the terror we endured, but as a reminder. In the wild, nature has its own ancient language, and sometimes the whispers of the past come calling when we least expect them.